Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the darkest chapter of human health, a time when death could knock on your door in the morning and take you before sunset. Imagine waking up feeling perfectly fine, then by afternoon, your skin turns a ghostly blue-grey. Your body convulses with cramps so severe you scream, and by midnight, you are gone. This was not some horror movie. This was London in the 1830s. This was cholera. And what makes it even more terrifying? The doctors had absolutely no idea how to stop it. They did not even know what caused it. In fact, some of their attempts to help actually made everything worse. So how did a disease from halfway around the world bring the most powerful city on earth to its knees? And what does a water pump in the middle of a street have to do with saving thousands of lives? Stay with me tonight, because this story will change the way you think about the water you drink, the air you breathe, and just how fragile our modern world really is. Now, before we dive deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying what you're hearing right now, if you find yourself curious about what comes next, would you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel? Hit that like button if this story speaks to you, and maybe leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. Are you in bed with the lights low, on a night drive? I genuinely love knowing who is listening. Your support means everything, and it helps me bring you more stories like this one. Alright, let's dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a soft fan for that gentle background hum, and let's step back in time together to 1831 London. Picture this. It is a cool autumn evening in the port town of Sunderland in the northeast of England. Ships arrive daily from ports across Europe and Asia, their hulls loaded with goods, their crews tired from weeks at sea. But in October of 1831, those ships brought something else, something invisible, something deadly. The first cases appeared quietly. A sailor here, a dock worker there. They complained of stomach cramps, then sudden, violent diarrhea. Within hours they were vomiting uncontrollably. Their bodies, desperate to expel whatever was attacking them, purged every ounce of fluid they had. And then came the truly horrifying part. As dehydration set in, their skin began to change colour. Not pale, not flushed with fever, but blue. A dark, dusky blue-grey that made them look more like corpses than living people. Their eyes sank deep into their skulls. Their skin became cold, clammy, shriveled like dried fruit. Some died so quickly that they were healthy in the morning and dead by dinner time. 24 hours. That was all it took. The British had heard rumours about this disease. It had been ravaging India for years, spreading through Asia like wildfire. They called it Asiatic cholera. And everyone hoped, prayed, really, that it would stay on the other side of the world. But global trade does not care about borders, and in 1831 cholera arrived in Britain. By the following year it had reached London. And London, oh London, was the perfect breeding ground for disaster. Let me paint you a picture of Victorian London that you will not find in the romantic novels. Yes, there were grand buildings and elegant carriages and ladies in beautiful dresses, but behind that facade, the city was drowning in its own filth. We are talking about a city of over 2 million people crammed into spaces designed for maybe half that number. The poor lived in slums where entire families shared single rooms. There was no running water in most homes, no indoor plumbing. People dumped their waste, human waste, into cesspits in their courtyards or directly into the streets. These cesspits would overflow, seeping into the ground, contaminating everything. And when they overflowed too much, workers would come and dump the contents directly into the River Thames, the same River Thames that supplied drinking water to much of the city. Now here is where it gets darkly ironic. The Victorians were obsessed with cleanliness. They really were. But they had their science completely backwards. You see, they believed in something called the miasma theory. Miasma. Beautiful word, terrible concept. The idea was that diseases spread through bad air, through foul-smelling vapours that rose from rotting organic matter. And you know what? When you walk through Victorian London, that theory made perfect sense. The city smelled absolutely horrible. The stench of human waste, rotting garbage, dead animals, industrial pollution, it all mixed together into an unholy fog that hung over the streets. So naturally people thought, well, this bad smell must be what is making us sick. This belief shaped everything they did. When cholera struck, authorities would order the streets cleaned, garbage removed, cesspits emptied. All good things, right? Except they would dump all that waste into the Thames. They actually thought they were helping by removing the source of bad smells. They were literally poisoning their own water supply while congratulating themselves on their public health measures. It is almost funny in a tragic sort of way. Almost. The first major London outbreak hit in 1832. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. Cholera did not discriminate by class the way other diseases seem to. Yes, it hit the poor neighbourhoods hardest, but wealthy people died too. Nobody was truly safe, and the speed of it. That was what terrified people. You could be fine at breakfast and dead by bedtime. Families would lose multiple members in a single week. Entire neighbourhoods would be decimated. The death carts rolled through the streets at night, collecting bodies. So many bodies. Now the medical establishment, they tried everything. And when I say everything, I mean some truly wild things. Remember, they thought cholera spread through bad air. So treatments focused on, well, all the wrong things. They would bleed patients with leeches, thinking that removing bad blood would help. They would give patients laudanum, that is opium mixed with alcohol, to calm the stomach. They tried turpentine plasters on the skin. They tried making patients vomit even more, believing that would purge the illness. None of it worked. In fact, many of these treatments probably made things worse, weakening patients who were already desperately dehydrated. But here is what they did not try: giving patients clean water, keeping them hydrated. Because why would they? They did not think water had anything to do with it. There was actually one doctor, a man named Thomas Latter, who in 1832 figured out that injecting saline solution directly into patients' veins dramatically improved survival rates. He was giving them what we now call intravenous fluids. This was revolutionary, life-saving. But nobody listened to him. Why? Because at the same time, literally hundreds of so-called cures were being published in newspapers and medical journals. Snake oil salesmen and actual doctors competed for attention with their miracle elixirs and magnetic therapies and herbal concoctions. The signal got lost in the noise, and people kept dying. The 1832 outbreak eventually faded, as epidemics do. But cholera was not done with London, not by a long shot. It came back in 1848 and 49, and this outbreak was even worse. We're talking about 2,000 deaths per week at the peak. 2,000 people every single week, dead from a disease that killed them in less than a day. The grief was unimaginable. The fear was palpable, and still nobody knew what actually caused cholera. The miasma theory remained the dominant explanation, but then came a man who changed everything. His name was John Snow, and no, not that John Snow. This one was a London physician, a quiet, methodical man who was not satisfied with the easy answers everyone else accepted. During the 1848 outbreak, Snow started to notice patterns. He observed that cholera seemed to cluster around certain areas, not just where the air smelled bad, but where people drew their water from specific sources. He started to form a theory, a radical theory for his time, What if cholera was not spread by a bad air at all? What if it was spread through contaminated water? He published a paper in 1849 laying out his theory. Almost nobody paid attention. The medical establishment was not ready to abandon miasma theory. After all, it made so much intuitive sense. Bad smells, bad health, clean smells, good health, simple. Except it was wrong. Snow got his chance to prove his theory in 1854, during what became known as the Broad Street outbreak. In late August, cholera exploded in the Soho neighbourhood of London. Within days, over 600 people in a tiny area had died. People were fleeing the neighbourhood in terror. Snow sprang into action. He started mapping every single cholera case, marking them on a detailed map of the area. And he interviewed survivors and families of victims, asking them one crucial question: where did you get your water? A pattern emerged, a clear, undeniable pattern. The vast majority of cases clustered around one location, a public water pump on Broad Street. This pump was used by hundreds of people in the neighbourhood. It was convenient. The water tasted fine. But Snow's investigation revealed something horrifying. Just a few feet from this pump, there was a cesspit connected to a house where a baby had recently died of cholera. The cesspit was leaking. Contaminated water was seeping through the old bricks and rotting mortar, flowing underground and contaminating the well that fed the Broad Street pump. People were literally drinking water mixed with cholera-infected human waste. Snow presented his findings to local authorities and convinced them to do something simple but radical. Remove the handle from the Broad Street pump. Just take it off so people could not use it anymore. They did, and within days the outbreak began to subside. People were forced to get their water from other sources, cleaner sources, and they stopped getting sick. The evidence was overwhelming. Cholera was waterborne. But here is the frustrating part. Even after this dramatic demonstration, many people still did not believe Snow. The miasma theory was too deeply entrenched. It took years and more outbreaks and more deaths before the medical establishment finally accepted the truth. It was not until the 1860s, after Snow had died, that his work was fully vindicated. A statistician named William Farr, who had been one of Snow's critics, finally admitted Snow had been right all along after studying the 1866 outbreak. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that actually changed the world. In the summer of 1858, something happened that finally forced London to act on its sanitation crisis. They called it the Great Stink. Picture this. It is the hottest summer in decades. The River Thames, already disgusting under normal circumstances, became absolutely unbearable. The smell was so intense, so overwhelmingly foul, that the Houses of Parliament right next to the river had to shut down. Lawmakers could not work. They would hang sheets soaked in chloride of lime over the windows, trying to block the stench. It did not help. The curtains in the library had to be soaked in disinfectant. Still, the cell seeped through. Members of Parliament, these powerful men who had ignored public health crises in poor neighbourhoods for decades, suddenly could not escape the consequences of London's sewage problem. Because now it was affecting them personally. And here is the thing. Wealthy neighbourhoods had been installing flush toilets, thinking they were being so modern and sanitary. But these toilets just dumped waste directly into the Thames. The more sanitary rich people tried to be, the more they polluted the river. It is kind of poetic in a gross way. The very measures they took to distance themselves from filth ended up making the whole city more diseased. The Great Stink finally motivated Parliament to act. They commissioned engineer Joseph Bazalgette to design a completely new sewer system for London. And let me tell you, this was one of the great engineering projects of the 19th century. Bazalgette designed 82 miles of main sewers, over 1,300 miles of street sewers, all built to carry waste away from the city and discharge it downstream, far from the water supply. The project took years and cost millions of pounds, but it worked. Cholera cases in London dropped dramatically. The last major outbreak was in 1866, and even that was traced to a water company that had not properly isolated its supply from sewage. Basildetta sewers still form the backbone of London's waste management system today. Think about that. A project started in the 1860s, inspired by a disease that killed thousands and a smell so bad it shut down the government, is still protecting London more than 150 years later. That is legacy. But the story of cholera does not end in Victorian London. This disease is still with us. Even today, cholera kills thousands of people every year in parts of the world where clean water and proper sanitation are not guaranteed. There have been outbreaks in recent decades in Yemen, in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, in Zimbabwe, in Nigeria. The World Health Organization estimates that cholera affects up to 4 million people annually worldwide, causing up to 140,000 deaths. The same disease, the same basic cause, contaminated water. We have the knowledge to prevent it. We have had that knowledge since Jon Snow's time, but knowledge means nothing without infrastructure, without investment in public health, without clean water systems. And here is what keeps me up at night sometimes. We, especially those of us in wealthy countries, take clean water so completely for granted. You turn on the tap and out comes safe, drinkable water. You flush the toilet and waste disappears into a system you never think about. But these are not natural features of civilization. They are achievements, hard-won achievements built on the graves of thousands of cholera victims, engineered by people who learned from catastrophic failures, maintained by infrastructure that requires constant attention and investment. Victorian London learned the hard way that invisible threats are still threats, that convenience and tradition and common sense are not substitutes for actual science, that sometimes the answer to a terrible problem is simple, like removing a pump handle, but getting people to accept that simple answer can be the hardest part of all. As we close this first chapter, I want you to think about something. Those Victorians standing in the streets of Soho watching their neighbours die by the dozens, they could not see the bacteria in their water. Vibrio cholerae is invisible to the naked eye. The contamination that killed them was odourless, tasteless, completely undetectable by human senses. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, armed with theories that made intuitive sense but were completely wrong. And it took a combination of tragedy, careful observation, and sheer stubbornness to finally uncover the truth. In our next part, we are going to explore another Victorian killer, but this one had a completely different character. While cholera killed with shocking speed, this next disease killed slowly, romantically, turning death into an aesthetic that shaped art and literature for generations. It was called consumption, and it claimed about 1/3 of all Victorian deaths. But why did people romanticize a disease that destroyed their lungs and left them wasting away? Why did artists and writers actually want to look like they had it? Stay with me as we uncover the strange, tragic story of tuberculosis, the White Plague that haunted an entire era. Sleep well, everyone, and maybe, just maybe, take a moment to appreciate that glass of clean water on your nightstand. So we have just explored how cholera could kill you in a day. Now let me tell you about a disease that took its time. A disease so prevalent in Victorian society that it killed roughly 1 out of every 3 people who died during that era. 1 in 3. Think about that for a moment. But here is what makes this disease truly strange, truly fascinating in the darkest possible way. People romanticized it. They turned it into an aesthetic. Young women wanted to look like they had it. Artists painted it as beautiful. Poets wrote about it as if death by this disease was somehow more noble, more ethereal than dying any other way. The disease was tuberculosis. The Victorians called it consumption because it quite literally consumed you from the inside out. And the story of how a lung disease became fashionable is one of the most bizarre chapters in medical history. Let me take you back to a different kind of deathbed. Not the violent, rapid horror of cholera, but something slower, quieter, more insidious. Picture a young woman in her early 20s, lying in a 4-poster bed in a well-appointed room. She is thin, extremely thin, but in the candlelight there is something almost ethereal about her appearance. Her skin's pale, almost translucent. There is a flush of colour high on her cheekbones. Her eyes seem unusually large and bright in her gaunt face. She coughs delicately into a handkerchief, and when she pulls it away, there are small spots of blood, bright red against white linen. The doctor shakes his head sadly. Her family weeps, but they also whisper about how beautiful she looks, how tragic, how poetic. This is consumption in the Victorian imagination. Now, before we go further into this strange romanticization, let me tell you what tuberculosis actually does to a human body, because the reality was far from poetic. Tuberculosis is caused by a bacterium called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. The Victorians did not know this, of course. The bacterium was not identified until 1882 by a German physician named Robert Koch, but they knew the disease intimately. They saw it everywhere. Tuberculosis most commonly attacks the lungs, though it can affect other parts of the body too. The bacteria create small nodules, tubercles, in the lung tissue. These grow and spread, destroying healthy tissue, creating cavities. As the disease progresses, the lungs lose their ability to function properly. Patients develop a persistent cough that worsens over months or years. They cough up sputum, which eventually becomes streaked with blood as the bacteria eat through blood vessels in the lungs. They lose weight dramatically because their body is fighting a constant infection, and they often lose their appetite. They develop night sweats so severe they have to change their bedclothes multiple times. They become exhausted from the slightest exertion, and slowly, inexorably, they waste away. Hence the name, consumption. The disease consumed you. And here is the truly terrifying part. Tuberculosis is contagious. It spreads through the air when an infected person coughs or sneezes. All those elegant Victorian parlours where people gathered, perfect places for transmission. All those boarding schools where children shared dormitories, breeding grounds. All those overcrowded urban apartments where multiple families lived in tight quarters. The bacteria spread like wildfire. But because the disease progressed slowly, it could take years from infection to death. People did not make the connection the way they did with cholera's immediate devastation. So why on earth would anyone romanticize this? Well, let me introduce you to the concept of the romantic death. In the early to mid-1800s, there was a cultural movement, particularly among the artistic and literary elite, that associated creativity with suffering. The idea was that true artistic genius required deep feeling, profound emotion, and what deeper emotion could there be than slowly dying? Add to this the physical symptoms of early-stage tuberculosis, and you get something that fit the aesthetic ideals of the time almost perfectly. Think about it from a Victorian perspective. The ideal beauty standard for women at this time was pale skin, very pale. A suntan meant you worked outdoors, which meant you were lower class. Pale skin was aristocratic, and tuberculosis made you extremely pale. The disease caused weight loss, and the Victorian ideal was a tiny waist, a delicate frame. Tuberculosis gave you that. The fever associated with the disease created that telltale flush on the cheeks, which was considered attractive. The brightness of the eyes from fever was interpreted as passionate intensity. Even the coughing up of blood had a certain tragic drama to it. It was visible suffering, which artists and writers could work with. And so incredibly, grotesquely, consumption became fashionable. Young women would actually try to achieve the consumptive look through cosmetics and corsets. They would use powders to make their skin paler. They would wear rouge high on their cheekbones to mimic that fevered flush. They would tight-lace their corsets to make their waists impossibly small and give themselves that delicate, breathless quality. Some fashion historians believe that the dangerous practice of tight lacing, which could actually damage internal organs, persisted partly because it made women look more like consumption patients. Let that sink in for a moment. People were deliberately trying to look like they were dying of a lung disease. The artistic community was hit particularly hard by tuberculosis, which only reinforced the association between the disease and creativity. The poet John Keats died of consumption at age 25. Percy Bysshe Shelley lost multiple family members to it. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily and Anne, all died of tuberculosis, along with their brother Branwell. Emily was only 30 years old. Anne was 29. These were people in the prime of their creative lives, cut down by a disease that ravaged their lungs. And their contemporaries looked at these tragic deaths and somehow concluded that there was something special, something artistically significant about consumption. But let me tell you about a death that was not romantic at all. Let me tell you about Charles Darwin's daughter Annie. Annie Darwin was, by all accounts, a delightful child. Her father adored her. He called her the joy of the household. She was curious, affectionate, full of life. In 1851, when Annie was 10 years old, she began showing symptoms of what was likely tuberculosis. She developed a fever. She grew weak. Darwin, desperate to save his daughter, took her to a spa in Worcestershire, a town in central England. Spas were a popular treatment for consumption because people believed that clean air and water therapy could cure the disease. Can you imagine Darwin's desperation? Here was a man who was beginning to formulate ideas about evolution, about the natural world, about the mechanisms of life itself, and he was utterly powerless to save his own child. Annie suffered for a week at that spa, a week of fever, of pain, of her body failing despite every effort to save her, and then she died. Darwin was devastated, absolutely shattered. He wrote about her death in terms that showed no romanticism whatsoever, just raw, unbearable grief. He described her as the joy of the household and her loss as almost unbearable. There was nothing poetic about watching your 10-year-old child waste away from a disease nobody could cure. And Darwin's tragedy was not unique. It was repeated in households across England, across Europe, across America. Tuberculosis did not discriminate. It killed the rich and the poor, though the poor died in greater numbers due to crowded living conditions. It killed adults and children. It killed artists and labourers. And for every writer who penned a tragic poem about beautiful death, there were thousands of families experiencing the ugly, painful reality of watching a loved one slowly suffocate over months or years. Here is another story that shows just how devastating tuberculosis could be. Remember those famous literary sisters I mentioned, the Brontes? Their story is not just tragic, it is almost incomprehensibly cruel. The family lived in a parsonage in Haworth, a village in Yorkshire in northern England. Between 1825 and 1849, the Bronte family lost 6 children to tuberculosis. 6. The mother died. Then the 2 eldest daughters, Maria and Elizabeth, died within weeks of each other while away at boarding school. They were 11 and 10 years old. Years later, after the surviving children had grown up and the sisters had become famous novelists, tuberculosis came back. Branwell, the only brother, died in the September of 1848. Emily died that December, just 3 months later. She was 30 years old and had published only one novel, Wuthering Heights, which would become one of the most famous books in English literature. Anne died the following May. She was 29. Charlotte was left alone, the last survivor of her siblings. She lived another 6 years before dying in 1855, possibly also from tuberculosis, though she was pregnant at the time and the cause of death is debated. Think about that family. Think about the father, Patrick Bronte, outliving his wife and all 6 of his children. Think about Charlotte. Writing and publishing, always knowing that the disease that had killed everyone she loved might come for her too. Where is the romance in that? Where is the beauty? But the cultural narrative persisted. In part, this was because the mechanism of transmission was not understood. People knew consumption ran in families, so they thought it was hereditary. This actually made it seem more tragic, more inevitable, more like a cruel twist of fate rather than a preventable disease. The idea that certain families were consumptive families, doomed by their bloodline, added to the Gothic romanticism of it all. It was like a curse in a fairy tale. The treatment options were frankly terrible. And by terrible, I mean they ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. The most common treatment was the rest cure. Patients were sent to sanatoriums, special hospitals for tuberculosis patients, where they were supposed to rest in clean air, eat nutritious food and recover. The theory was that the body could heal itself if given the right environment. And you know what? For some people, particularly those in early stages of the disease with otherwise healthy immune systems, this actually helped. Rest, good nutrition, fresh air, these things can support the immune system. But it was not a cure. Many patients spent years in sanatoriums, separated from their families, slowly declining despite the pristine mountain air. Some treatments were more creative, and by creative I mean bizarre. Doctors would prescribe cod liver oil, which at least had some nutritional value. They would recommend sea voyages, believing that sea air had healing properties. They would suggest moving to warmer climates, which is why so many Victorian invalids ended up in places like Italy or the south of France. There was some logic to this. Cold, damp conditions are harder on damaged lungs, but it was not actually curing the disease. It was just making people slightly more comfortable while they died. And then there were the truly wild treatments. Some doctors advocated for bleeding patients, still clinging to old ideas about balancing the humours. Others prescribed mercury. Yes, mercury again, that Victorian cure-all that was more poison than medicine. Some recommended horseback riding, believing the jostling motion would help clear the lungs. Imagine being exhausted, barely able to breathe, and having your doctor tell you to go gallop around on a horse. There were devices that were supposed to expand the lungs through mechanical means. None of it worked. The only thing that actually reduced tuberculosis deaths in the Victorian era was not medical treatment at all. It was improvements in living conditions. As housing improved, as overcrowding decreased, as nutrition got better, as general public health measures were implemented, tuberculosis rates began to fall. Very slowly, very gradually. But they fell. By the early 20th century, even before effective medicines were developed, tuberculosis was killing fewer people than it had in the 1800s, simply because people were living in less cramped, less diseased conditions. The real breakthrough came much later. In 1943, a soil microbiologist named Selman Waksman discovered streptomycin, the first antibiotic that was effective against tuberculosis. Finally, after centuries of this disease ravaging humanity, there was an actual cure. Not fresh air, not cod liver oil, not moving to Italy, but medicine that killed the bacteria. Streptomycin, combined with other antibiotics developed later, transformed tuberculosis from a death sentence into a curable disease. Waksman won the Nobel Prize for this discovery, and he deserved it. How many lives did that discovery save? Millions. Tens of millions. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Tuberculosis is still with us. Even today it kills more people than any other infectious disease except COVID-19 during the pandemic years. About 1.5 million people die from tuberculosis every year. 1.5 million. The disease is particularly devastating in parts of Africa and Asia, where poverty, malnutrition, and HIV weaken immune systems. And now we have drug-resistant strains of tuberculosis that do not respond to standard antibiotics. The bacteria are evolving, finding ways to survive our medicines. So the battle that the Victorians fought with their sanatoriums and their cod liver oil and their romantic poetry is not over. We have better weapons now. We have antibiotics. We have vaccines. We have public health systems that can track and treat the disease. But we also have complacency. We have people in wealthy countries who think tuberculosis is a disease of the past, something confined to Victorian novels and old photographs. And that complacency is dangerous because bacteria do not care about borders or wealth or historical periods. They only care about finding hosts to infect. I want you to think about something. The Victorians romanticized consumption partly because they felt powerless against it. They could not see the bacteria. They could not cure the disease. So they turned it into art, into poetry, into tragic beauty. It was a coping mechanism, a way to find meaning in meaningless death. And I have some sympathy for that. When you cannot fix something, sometimes all you can do is try to make it beautiful. But we are not Victorians. We have knowledge they did not have. We have tools they could not imagine. We know exactly what causes tuberculosis. We know how it spreads. We know how to cure it. And yet we still allow 1.5 million people to die from it every year because those deaths happen far away, to people who are poor, to people who do not have access to the medicines and care that we take for granted. There is nothing romantic about that. There is nothing poetic about a grandmother in rural India coughing up blood because she cannot afford antibiotics. There is nothing beautiful about a child in South Africa dying from drug-resistant tuberculosis because funding for new antibiotic research has dried up. The romanticism of the Victorian era was built on ignorance. But our indifference today, that is built on something worse. That is built on knowledge that we choose not to act on. If the Victorians should see what we have now, our antibiotics, our imaging technology that can photograph diseased lungs, our understanding of bacteria and immune systems, they would think we were living in a paradise of medical miracles. And in many ways we are. But miracles are only miraculous if everyone has access to them. The White Plague taught the Victorians about the fragility of life, about the cruelty of nature, about the limits of human power against invisible enemies. What has it taught us? Have we learned anything? Or have we just moved the suffering somewhere we do not have to look at it? Coming up next, we are diving into a treatment that was somehow even worse than the disease it was supposed to cure. Imagine being told you have a venereal disease, something Victorian society saw as shameful, something that could destroy your reputation, your marriage, your life. Now imagine the doctor's cure involves rubbing toxic metal into your skin, breathing its vapors, even inserting it into places I cannot believe I'm going to talk about in a bedtime story. We are talking about mercury treatment for syphilis, and the old saying 2 minutes with Venus, 2 years with Mercury will make horrifying sense. This one is dark, so stay close. Until then, rest well and maybe take a moment to appreciate that we live in an age where tuberculosis is curable. For most of us, anyway. There is an old medical saying from the Victorian era that went like this: 2 minutes with Venus, 2 years with Mercury. Venus, the goddess of love. Mercury, the liquid metal that was supposed to cure venereal disease. And if you are wondering why the treatment took 2 years while the act that caused the infection took 2 minutes, well, buckle up, because we are about to explore one of the most horrifying medical practices in history. A treatment that was, in many cases, more deadly than the disease itself. A treatment that involved rubbing toxic metal into open sores, breathing poisonous vapors, and yes, inserting mercury-laden solutions into places that make me cringe just thinking about it. Welcome to the world of syphilis treatment in the Victorian age, where the cure could destroy your organs, rot your jaw, drive you mad, and kill you, all while everyone blamed you for your own suffering. Before we dive into the nightmare that was mercury treatment, let me tell you what syphilis actually is, because the disease itself is already quite terrible without any help from doctors. Syphilis is caused by a spiral-shaped bacterium called Treponema pallidum. The Victorians did not know this. The bacterium was not identified until 1905 by a German zoologist and a dermatologist working together. But they certainly knew the disease. It had been terrorizing Europe since the late 1400s, and by the Victorian era it was everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. Syphilis progresses in stages, and each stage is worse than the last. The primary stage begins a few weeks after infection. A painless sore called a chancre appears at the site of infection, usually the genitals but not always. And here is the cruel trick. It is painless, and it heals on its own after a few weeks. So many people thought, oh, whatever that was, it has gone away. But the bacterium had not gone away, it had just moved deeper into the body. The secondary stage arrives weeks or months later. This is when things get visually obvious and socially catastrophic. A rash appears, typically on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Unusual places for a rash, which is actually diagnostically important. The rash can spread all over the body. Hair falls out in patches, creating a moth-eaten appearance, fever, fatigue, swollen lymph nodes. And these symptoms could come and go, which gave people false hope that they were recovering. But they were not recovering. The disease was just entering its latent phase, hiding in the body sometimes for years, doing damage silently. And then came the tertiary stage. This is when syphilis showed its true horror. The bacterium attacked whatever part of the body it had settled into. In many cases, it went after the nervous system. Neurosyphilis could cause dementia, psychosis, paralysis, blindness. People would lose their minds, literally. They would develop personality changes, become violent or depressed, lose the ability to walk or speak. The disease could attack the cardiovascular system, weakening blood vessels, causing aneurysms. It could attack the bones, creating lesions that would eat through the skull or the face, and it created something called gummers, these horrible, soft, tumour-like masses that would form in the skin, the bones, the organs. Gummers on the face would destroy the nose, creating holes where there should be tissue. The disfigurement was severe, unmistakable, and permanent. Now, imagine living in Victorian society with this disease. Remember, this was an era obsessed with respectability, with moral purity, with maintaining appearances, and syphilis was seen as a moral disease, a punishment for sexual immorality. If you had syphilis, it meant you had been with a prostitute, or you were a prostitute, or you had committed adultery. The stigma was crushing. People would hide their symptoms for as long as possible, which of course meant they continued spreading the disease to others. Wives got it from unfaithful husbands. Husbands got it from wives who had been assaulted or coerced. Children were born with congenital syphilis, suffering from birth for their parents' infection. The whole thing was a nightmare of suffering and shame. So when someone finally sought treatment, usually because they could no longer hide their symptoms, what did Victorian medicine offer them? Mercury, poisonous, toxic mercury. And they'd been using mercury to treat syphilis since the 1500s. Think about that. 300 years of using a treatment that did not actually cure the disease and caused terrible harm in the process. Why did they keep using it? Because sometimes patients seemed to get better. Their symptoms would disappear, the rashes would fade, the sores would heal, and doctors would declare victory over the disease. But here is what was actually happening. Syphilis naturally goes through phases of symptoms and remission. It was not the mercury curing anything, it was just the disease's natural cycle. The bacteria would become dormant for a while and symptoms would fade regardless of treatment. but doctors and patients saw the timeline: mercury treatment followed by symptom relief, and assumed causation. It is the same logical fallacy that has led people astray for centuries. Correlation is not causation, but when you are desperate and suffering, you will believe whatever gives you hope. The mercury treatments came in several horrifying forms. Let me walk you through them, and I apologize in advance because some of this is genuinely disturbing. The most common form was mercury ointment. Patients would rub this grey, greasy ointment onto their skin, particularly over the sores and rashes. The idea was that the mercury would be absorbed through the skin and somehow kill the disease inside the body. And it was absorbed, all right. Mercury is a heavy metal, and it is toxic to human cells. It would get into the bloodstream and accumulate in organs, the kidneys especially, the brain, the liver. Then there were mercury vapor baths. Patients would sit in a small enclosed space and mercury would be heated below them so that they would breathe in the vapors. Can you imagine? Sitting in a box, inhaling the fumes of liquid metal, believing this was healing you? The vapor would be absorbed through the lungs and enter the bloodstream that way. Even more direct, even more toxic. There were also mercury pills called blue mass or blue pills. These contained mercury in either its elemental form or as mercurous chloride, also known as calomel. People would take these pills daily, and a typical daily dose contained over 100 times the amount of mercury that modern environmental protection agencies consider safe. 100 times. Let me give you a concrete example. Abraham Lincoln, yes, that Abraham Lincoln, the American president, took blue mass pills for years before his presidency. He was suffering from what they called melancholia, what we would now recognize as depression. And mercury was prescribed for all sorts of conditions, including depression. Lincoln reportedly took these pills regularly, and during that time he exhibited symptoms that we now recognize as mercury poisoning: insomnia, tremors, and rage attacks. He was described as becoming unusually irritable and cross, and after his inauguration as president, Lincoln reportedly stopped taking the pills because he realized they were making him feel worse, not better. Imagine if he had not stopped. How might history have been different if the 16th President of the United States had continued poisoning himself with mercury throughout the Civil War? But wait, it gets worse. Are you ready for this? There were mercury douches, vaginal and urethral douches. A French instrument maker created special devices for this. A receptacle for holding liquid mercury compound, with a green hose and attachments of various sizes for insertion into the vagina or urethra. Doctors would inject mercury solutions directly into the urogenital tract, believing this would fight the infection at its source. The pain must have been extraordinary, the tissue damage severe, and the absorption of mercury into the bloodstream through those delicate, highly vascular tissues, extremely efficient, which means extremely poisonous. There is a documented case from 1916. Yes, 1916. This practice continued well into the 20th century. Of a 27-year-old woman who used mercury perchloride tablets dissolved in water as a douche. She then placed one tablet directly into her vagina. Within hours, she developed severe pain, swelling, cramping diarrhea, and persistent vomiting. Her kidneys failed. She died 6 days later. The medical journal article about her death concluded, "This case ought to constitute a warning to physicians that mercury can hardly be employed with safety in this manner." You think? This was in 1916, and they were still acting like this was a new discovery. So what did mercury poisoning look like? Because remember, patients were often being treated with mercury for months or years. The symptoms were brutal and distinctive. First came excessive salivation. Patients would drool uncontrollably as the mercury damaged their salivary glands. Their gums would swell and become painful. Then their teeth would loosen and fall out. The mercury would cause necrosis, tissue death in the mouth. Jawbones would rot. The smell of decay would be overwhelming. This was not an uncommon side effect. This was expected. There was even a term for it in medical literature. Mercury poisoning also caused severe neurological symptoms, tremors, particularly of the hands. This symptom was so common in hat makers, who used mercury in the felting process, that it gave rise to the phrase "mad as a hatter." The tremors would progress to full-body shaking. Patients would develop extreme anxiety and pathological shyness. They would suffer from depression and personality changes. Some would experience what was called mercurial erethism, characterized by frequent sighing, withdrawal from social situations, and eventually full psychotic breaks. So you would go to the doctor with syphilis, get treated with mercury, and end up with rotting jaws, shaking hands, depression, and possible psychosis. Oh, and you would still have syphilis because the mercury was not actually curing it. The mercury would damage kidneys, causing renal failure. It would damage the liver. It would cause skin lesions and ulcers all over the body. Patients would lose their hair. They would develop chronic diarrhea. Their heart rhythms would become irregular. And many patients died from the mercury treatment rather than from the syphilis itself. But because these deaths happened slowly, over months or years of treatment, doctors often did not make the connection. They would just note that the patient had died of complications or organ failure without recognizing that the organ failure was caused by the poison they had been prescribing. Now, some patients recognized this. There were people who said quite reasonably, "I think the medicine is making me sicker than the disease." But their voices were drowned out by medical authority. Doctors insisted that mercury was effective. Medical textbooks recommended it. It had been used for centuries, which somehow made it seem more legitimate rather than less. This is the danger of tradition in medicine. Just because something has been done for a long time does not mean it should continue to be done. And here is where the story takes a turn that shows just how deeply patriarchal Victorian society was. In 1864, the British government passed something called the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws were supposedly designed to reduce venereal disease among soldiers and sailors by controlling prostitution. But the way they did this was absolutely draconian, completely one-sided. Under these acts, any woman suspected of being a prostitute could be arrested and forced to undergo an invasive medical examination. If she was found to have syphilis or gonorrhea, she would be confined to a special hospital called a lock hospital, sometimes for many months. If she refused the examination, she could be sentenced to 6 months of hard labour in prison. Notice who was being targeted here. Women, only women, the men who were visiting prostitutes, the men who were spreading disease, the men who in many cases were the original source of infection. They faced no legal consequences whatsoever. They were not required to be examined. They were not imprisoned. They were not even named. The entire burden of controlling venereal disease was placed on women, who were already among the most vulnerable members of society. And these forced medical examinations were not gentle procedures. They were painful, humiliating, and traumatic. Women had no right to refuse. Their bodies were not their own under these laws. This sparked outrage, and rightfully so. Social reformers, including many women, campaigned against the Contagious Diseases Acts for years. They pointed out the obvious hypocrisy, the cruelty, the complete lack of justice in targeting women while ignoring men. And finally, in 1886, after years of protest, the acts were repealed. But the damage had been done. Thousands of women had been humiliated, imprisoned, and traumatized. And the laws had not even been effective at reducing venereal disease rates, because shockingly you cannot control an infectious disease by punishing only half the people involved in transmitting it. Meanwhile, the search for an actual cure continued. Mercury remained the standard treatment well into the early 1900s, despite its horrific side effects. In 1910, a real breakthrough finally came. A German scientist named Paul Ehrlich, working with his Japanese assistant Saiichiro Hata, developed a drug called salvarsan. It was an arsenic-based compound. And yes, arsenic is also toxic, but it was actually effective against the syphilis bacterium. For the first time in history, there was a drug that could actually kill Treponema pallidum without killing the patient first. Well, usually without killing the patient. Salvarsan had significant side effects too, but it was a massive improvement over mercury. Ehrlich called it 606 because it was the 606th compound he had tested in his search for a cure. Can you imagine that level of persistence? 605 failures before finding something that worked. But even salvarsan was not a perfect cure. It required multiple injections over a long period. It had to be administered carefully, and it was expensive, which meant poor people often could not access it. The real game changer came in the 1940s, penicillin. The antibiotic discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928 finally found its use against syphilis in the early 1940s, and it worked beautifully. Simple, effective, relatively safe. Syphilis, which had terrorized humanity for centuries, became a curable disease almost overnight. The case numbers in the United Kingdom dropped by 90% within 10 years of penicillin becoming standard treatment. Think about the timeline here. Syphilis arrived in Europe around 1495. Penicillin became the standard treatment in the 1940s. That is roughly 450 years of suffering. 450 years of people dying, going mad, being disfigured. 450 years of useless and harmful treatments. 450 years of shame and stigma. And then, suddenly, it was over. A simple injection of antibiotics, and you were cured. But here is what bothers me about this story, and maybe it will bother you too. The suffering was not necessary, not all of it. Yes, the Victorians did not have antibiotics. Yes, they did not know about bacteria. But they could observe. They could see that mercury was poisoning people. Some did see it. Some doctors spoke out against mercury treatment. But they were ignored because mercury was traditional, because it was what everyone had always done. Because admitting it did not work would mean admitting that generations of doctors had been harming their patients. This is not just a Victorian problem, this is a human problem. How many times do we continue doing something harmful simply because it is traditional? How many times do we ignore evidence because it contradicts what we want to believe? How many times do we blame victims instead of examining systems? The story of syphilis and mercury is a story about desperation and cruelty and the dangers of certainty in the face of ignorance. It is a story about how moral judgments get tangled up with medical treatment, usually to the detriment of the most vulnerable. It is a story about how sometimes the cure really is worse than the disease, and it is a reminder that progress in medicine is not inevitable. It requires skepticism, evidence, a willingness to admit when we are wrong, and most importantly, a commitment to do no harm, even when that means abandoning practices we are comfortable with. Next, we are going to talk about children, and I need to warn you this next part is heartbreaking. We are going to explore the diseases that Victorian parents feared most because they targeted the young. Diseases that could kill a healthy child in days, sometimes hours. Diseases that created a membrane in the throat so thick that children would literally strangle to death while their parents watched helplessly. We are talking about diphtheria, the disease that was called the strangling angel of children. And we are going to talk about the grief, the guilt, and the literature that tried to make sense of the fact that nearly half of all children did not survive to their 5th birthday. Stay with me for this next chapter, because understanding how the Victorians dealt with childhood disease tells us something profound about the fragility of life and the strength it takes to keep loving in the face of inevitable loss. Rest well and maybe hug your kids a little tighter. If you are a parent listening to this, I want you to do something for me right now. Take a deep breath. Just breathe in, hold it for a second, and breathe out. Easy, right? Natural, automatic. Now imagine watching your child struggle to do that same simple thing. Imagine watching them fight for every breath, their chest heaving, their face turning, colours it should never turn, while a thick grey membrane grows across their throat, sealing off their airway bit by bit. Imagine knowing that within days, maybe hours, they will suffocate. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. This was diphtheria. The Victorians called it the strangling angel of children. And that name was not poetic metaphor. It was literal description. This disease strangled children to death while their parents watched helplessly, and it did not discriminate. Rich families, poor families, careful families, careless families, diphtheria came for them all. Tonight we're going to talk about the disease that made Victorian parents live in constant fear, the disease that inspired some of the most heartbreaking scenes in literature, and the medical breakthrough that finally turned the tide. But I am warning you now, this one is going to hurt. Let me start by telling you what diphtheria actually does, because understanding the mechanism makes the horror of it even more real. Diphtheria is caused by a bacterium called Corynebacterium diphtheriae. It is a rod-shaped microbe that typically enters through the nose or mouth and sets up shop in the upper respiratory tract. Once there, it does something particularly nasty. The bacteria release a toxin, and this toxin causes the cells in the throat to die and slough off. As these dead cells accumulate, they combine with the bacteria, white blood cells and fibrin to form a thick, leathery membrane. This membrane is typically grey or greyish-white, and it adheres firmly to the throat, the tonsils, sometimes extending down into the larynx and trachea. Now, here is where it gets terrifying. As this membrane grows thicker and spreads, it literally blocks the airway. Children would feel it happening. They would feel the membrane tightening like a hand around their throat. They would struggle to breathe, producing a harsh, rasping sound with each attempt. Their breathing would become more and more laboured. The strain would be visible. Their chest muscles would pull in with each breath. Their neck muscles would strain. Their nostrils would flare desperately. And if the membrane was not removed or did not dislodge on its own, the child would asphyxiate. They would slowly strangle to death over hours or days, fully conscious for much of it, their parents watching every agonizing moment. And you know what made it worse? Diphtheria often started like a common cold. A child would develop a sore throat, maybe a low-grade fever, nothing that seemed particularly alarming at first. Victorian parents dealt with childhood illnesses all the time, but with diphtheria, within 24 to 48 hours, things would take a dark turn. The throat would swell, the membrane would appear, and suddenly you are in a race against death with very few weapons at your disposal. Let me give you some numbers that will help you understand just how devastating this disease was. In 1735 and 1736, there was a massive diphtheria epidemic in colonial New England. In the state of New Hampshire alone, which had a population of only 23,000 people at the time, over 1,000 people died, and 90% of those deaths were children under the age of 10. Entire families lost half their children in a matter of weeks. The lexicographer Noah Webster, yes, the dictionary Webster, called diphtheria the plague among children, and he was not exaggerating. But here is what really gets me about diphtheria. The disease was so common, so familiar, that people gave it dozens of different names without realizing they were all talking about the same illness. They called it synanche and angina, canker, bladders, rattles, throat distemper. Different regions, different names, same horrible disease. Some medical historians believe that because the symptoms overlapped with other throat infections, including scarlet fever, many death records are actually underestimating how many children died of diphtheria. The real toll might have been even higher than we know, and in the Victorian era proper, diphtheria was absolutely everywhere. It was endemic in cities and rural areas alike. Boarding schools were particularly hard hit because children lived in close quarters, sharing dormitories, dining halls, classrooms. One infected child could spark an outbreak that would sweep through an entire school in days. And remember, these were often children from wealthy families, sent away to prestigious institutions for education. Money could not protect you from diphtheria. Social status meant nothing to a bacterium. There is a scene in the novel Anne of Green Gables that many of you might remember. Young Anne Shirley becomes a hero for saving little Minnie May from diphtheria in the middle of the night. The description is vivid and accurate. The child gasping for breath, the desperate attempts to make her cough up the membrane, the very real possibility that she would die before morning. And readers of that book, when it was published in 1908, knew exactly what was being described because most of them had either experienced diphtheria in their own families or knew someone who had. It was that universal, that present, that feared. Now let me tell you about a treatment option that Victorian doctors had, and I need to warn you, this is not easy to hear about. When a child was suffocating from the diphtheria membrane and all other options had failed, there was one last desperate measure: tracheotomy. This is a surgical procedure where the doctor would cut a hole directly into the child's windpipe below where the membrane was blocking the airway and insert a tube so air could bypass the obstruction. Can you imagine? Imagine being a parent and having to consent to someone cutting into your child's throat. Imagine being a doctor having to perform this procedure, often in a private home with limited equipment and no anesthesia, or only crude anesthesia, on a child who was already weakened and terrified. And even if the procedure was successful, even if the doctor managed to create an airway, the child was not out of danger. The diphtheria toxin was still in their system, still damaging their heart, their nerves, their kidneys. Many children who survived the initial suffocation died days or weeks later from the effects of the toxin. But you want to know something that really shows how desperate parents were. Some people believed that the disease was connected to environmental causes that seem absurd to us now. During some epidemics, people reported seeing heavy infestations of black caterpillars right before diphtheria outbreaks, and so there developed a belief that the caterpillars somehow caused the disease. Now we know this is nonsense. The caterpillars and the disease were just happening at the same time. But when your child is dying and no one can tell you why or how to stop it, you will grasp at any explanation. You will blame caterpillars. You will blame the weather, bad air, divine punishment, anything that gives you something to focus on, something to possibly control. And speaking of things people could not control, let me tell you about contagion. By the later Victorian period, people were beginning to understand that diphtheria was contagious, that it spread from person to person. But their understanding was incomplete and sometimes led to heartbreaking situations. Families would quarantine sick children, isolating them in a room alone, often with just one caretaker, to prevent spread to other family members. The infected child would be separated from their siblings, sometimes not even allowed to see their parents. Imagine being 5 or 6 years old, struggling to breathe, terrified, and not being able to have your mother hold you because she might catch the disease and die too. Imagine being a mother, listening to your child cry out for you from behind a closed door and having to stay away. There were protocols for dealing with diphtheria cases that seem almost cruel now. Any cloth items the patient touched, bedding, clothing, handkerchiefs, would have to be burned or boiled. The sick room would be fumigated with disinfectants. Letters from families with diphtheria cases were treated with suspicion. People believed, not entirely incorrectly, that the disease could be carried on paper, in fabric, through the air itself. So communities would sometimes isolate entire families, preventing them from attending church, going to market, sending children to school. It was a social death sentence on top of a medical crisis. And then there were the long-term effects for children who survived. Even if a child made it through the acute phase of diphtheria, the toxin often caused lasting damage. The diphtheria toxin has an affinity for nerve tissue and heart muscle. Children who survived would sometimes develop paralysis weeks after the infection seemed to have cleared. It might start with difficulty swallowing, then spread to the limbs. Some children lost the ability to walk. Some developed heart problems that would plague them for the rest of their lives. So even survival was not always a happy ending. Parents would nurse their children through the horrifying acute phase, breathe a sigh of relief when the membrane cleared and the child seemed to recover, only to watch in horror as new complications emerged weeks later. Now, let me tell you about one of the most famous literary depictions of childhood death from disease and how it reflected the reality of Victorian grief. You've probably heard of the novel Little Women by the Louisa May Alcott. There is a scene where Beth March, the gentle, kind sister, dies. And while the book does not explicitly name the disease, many scholars believe Beth's lingering illness and death were inspired by scarlet fever complications. But the emotional truth of that scene, the family gathered around, the slow decline, the acceptance of inevitable death, that was universal to Victorian families dealing with any childhood disease, including diphtheria. What strikes me about these Victorian deathbed scenes is not that they are sentimental or exaggerated. It is that they were realistic. Victorian readers did not find these scenes over the top because they had lived them. They knew what it was like to watch a child die slowly. They knew the particular kind of grief that comes from having time to say goodbye, but not enough time to save them. Charles Dickens wrote about the death of Little Nell in the Old Curiosity Shop, and when the final instalment was published, there were reports of people shouting from the docks as ships arrived from England, "Does Little Nell live?" When they learned she died, there was public mourning. Modern readers sometimes mock this as excessive Victorian sentimentality, but those Victorian readers were not being silly or melodramatic. They were processing their own grief through fiction because so many of them had lost children. So many of them knew that grief intimately. When you have buried a child or when you live in constant fear that you might, stories about children dying are not entertainment. They are catharsis. The grief of losing a child to disease was so common in the Victorian era that it shaped art, literature, music, even fashion. Post-mortem photography became a widespread practice, with families having photographs taken of their deceased children, sometimes posed as if sleeping, sometimes with their eyes painted open on the photograph to make them appear alive. To our modern sensibilities, this seems morbid. But for Victorian families, especially poor families who could never have afforded a portrait of their child while alive, this was the only image they would ever have. It was precious, it was treasured, and it was heartbreaking. But here is where the story starts to turn. Here is where human ingenuity and medical science finally started to win against this strangling angel. In the late 1800s, researchers began to understand that diphtheria was caused by a specific bacterium, and that the bacterium produced a toxin. Two medical students, working from the research of the scientist Robert Koch, successfully developed an antitoxin. This was revolutionary. The antitoxin was made by injecting horses with small amounts of diphtheria toxin, allowing the horse's immune system to produce antibodies, and then harvesting those antibodies from the horse's blood. When given to a human patient, these antibodies could neutralize the diphtheria toxin before it caused fatal damage. The development of diphtheria antitoxin was announced in the early 1890s, and it is hard to overstate what a breakthrough this was. For the first time in history, there was an effective treatment for diphtheria. Not a cure exactly, it could not kill the bacteria, but something that could stop the toxin from killing the patient. Mortality rates dropped dramatically. Children who would have died now survived. The antitoxin had to be administered early in the infection to be most effective, which meant doctors had to recognize diphtheria quickly and act fast. But it worked. It genuinely worked. And then, even better, researchers developed a vaccine. By the 1920s, a diphtheria vaccine was available. Instead of treating children after they got sick, you could prevent them from getting sick in the first place. And when vaccination programs were rolled out widely, diphtheria cases plummeted. By the mid-20th century, diphtheria had gone from a leading cause of childhood death to a rare disease in countries with robust vaccination programs. Let me give you some numbers to show just how dramatic this change was. In England during the 1870s, at the height of Victorian industrialisation, there were tens of thousands of diphtheria cases every year, with mortality rates as high as 40 to 50% in severe cases. By the 1960s, after widespread vaccination, there were fewer than 100 cases per year in the entire United Kingdom. 100 cases, down from tens of thousands. That is the power of vaccines. That is what medical science achieved. But, and this is important, diphtheria is not gone. It still exists. In countries where vaccination rates are high, it is incredibly rare. But in places where vaccination programs have broken down due to war, poverty, or political instability, diphtheria can and does come back. There have been outbreaks in recent years in Yemen, in Venezuela, in parts of Africa and Asia. The disease is still there, still waiting, still capable of killing children just as efficiently as it did in Victorian England. We have not eradicated it. We have only pushed it back. And it can return if we let our guard down. I want you to think about something. Every child who gets vaccinated against diphtheria today is protected from a disease that killed thousands upon thousands of Victorian children. That vaccine represents generations of research, tragedy, determination, and hope. It represents all those parents who watched their children suffocate and thought, no one should have to go through this. It represents the doctors who performed desperate tracheotomies in dimly lit bedrooms and thought, there has to be a better way. It represents the researchers who worked with horse blood and bacterial cultures and thought, we can beat this. And yet we live in a time when some parents are choosing not to vaccinate their children. Not because vaccines are unavailable, not because they are too expensive, but because they have forgotten or never knew what these diseases actually do. They have the luxury of not knowing. Their children are not dying of diphtheria, so diphtheria seems abstract, theoretical, not worth worrying about. But the Victorians did not have that luxury. They knew diphtheria intimately. They feared it constantly, and they would have given anything for a vaccine that could protect their children. I am not trying to be preachy here, I am just telling you the history. And the history says that the strangling angel of children was real, was terrible, and was beaten back by science and public health. But it is not dead, it is just sleeping. And we need to remember why we fought so hard to put it to sleep in the first place. Coming up next, we were going to talk about another childhood killer. But this one had a very different character. Where diphtheria strangled, scarlet fever burned. This was the disease that could take a healthy child and turn them into a patient with blazing fever, distinctive rash and swollen glands within 48 hours. And in some cases, the child would be dead within 48 hours of the first symptoms. We're going to explore the disease that killed 5 of 7 children in one family in a single month. Yes, 5 children, 1 month. And we're going to talk about why scarlet fever is making a comeback in some parts of the world today. Because apparently Victorian diseases are not content to stay in Victorian times. Stay close, because this next chapter shows us just how quickly a disease can turn from manageable to deadly, and how grief can compound when death comes in waves. For now, take another deep breath, and maybe say a quiet thank you to the researchers who made sure your children can breathe freely. What would you do if you knew your child had 48 hours to live? Not months to prepare, not weeks to say goodbye, not even days to hope for a miracle. Just 2 days from the first symptom to death. That was scarlet fever at its worst. And I'm about to tell you a story that will break your heart. A true story that happened in 1856 to one of the most prominent families in England. Archibald Campbell Tate was the headmaster of Rugby School, one of Britain's most prestigious boarding schools. He was educated, wealthy, well-connected. He had 7 children whom he loved dearly, and in the space of just over 1 month, scarlet fever took 5 of them. 5 children, 1 month. The first child fell ill on March 1st. The last child died on April 10th. 40 days of relentless, compounding grief. And when it was finally over, only 2 of their 7 children remained alive. Tonight, we are going to talk about the disease that swept through families like a scythe through wheat, leaving devastation in its wake. We are going to talk about why it was so deadly, why it targeted children so ruthlessly, and why incredibly it is making a comeback in the 21st century. But first, let me tell you what scarlet fever actually is, because the name is almost deceptively pretty. Scarlet. It sounds like a colour, like a fancy dress, like something from a romance novel. But the reality was brutal. Scarlet fever is caused by a bacterium called Streptococcus pyogenes, the same family of bacteria that causes strep throat. But this particular strain produces a toxin that causes a distinctive rash, a scarlet-coloured rash that gives the disease its name. The rash feels like sandpaper to the touch, rough and bumpy. It typically starts on the neck and chest, then spreads all over the body. The face flushes bright red except around the mouth, which stays pale, creating what doctors called the scarlet fever mask. But the rash was just the visible symptom. What made scarlet fever so dangerous was what it did internally. The infection would cause extremely high fevers, sometimes reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The throat would become intensely painful and swollen. The tongue would develop a white coating at first, then peel to reveal a bright red surface that looked like a strawberry. Doctors literally called it strawberry tongue. The lymph nodes in the neck would swell dramatically. And in severe cases, the toxin would attack the heart, the kidneys, the joints. Children could develop rheumatic fever as a complication, which would damage their heart valves permanently. They could develop kidney failure. They could develop arthritis that would cripple them for life. And the speed of it, that was what terrified Victorian parents. A child could wake up with a sore throat in the morning, develop the rash by afternoon, spike a dangerous fever by evening, and be in a coma by the next day. Some children died within 48 hours of the first symptoms. Others lingered for a week or 2 before succumbing. But even the ones who died more slowly were suffering intensely. The fever was agonizing. The throat pain made swallowing nearly impossible. And unlike diphtheria, where at least there was a visible membrane you could potentially remove, with scarlet fever, there was nothing to cut out, nothing to dislodge. You just had to wait and hope the child's body could fight it off, and often it could not. Let me take you back to that household in 1856, the Tate family. Picture a comfortable home, servants, all the advantages that wealth and education could provide. And then imagine the nightmare beginning. The first child to fall ill was their daughter Frances, who was only 6 years old. She developed the telltale sore throat, then the rash. The family would have called in the best doctors available. They would have done everything they possibly could. But Francis died within days. And before the family could even properly grieve, another child fell ill. Then another. Then another. The disease was spreading through the household, moving from child to child despite every precaution. Can you imagine what that house must have been like? The desperate attempts to quarantine the sick children from the healthy ones, the around-the-clock nursing care, the prayers, the bargaining with God. Please, not this one too. Please, let this one survive. And then the awful moment of realization over and over again that another child was showing symptoms, that another fever was spiking, that another life was slipping away. By the time it was over, Archibald and his wife Catherine had lost 5 of their 7 children: Francis, age 6, May, age 9, Susan, age 8, Catherine, age 3, and Beatrice, age 5. All dead within 40 days. The 2 surviving children were Crawford, age 10, and Lucy, age 2. Why those 2 survived when their siblings did not, no one knows. Perhaps they had stronger immune systems. Perhaps they were exposed to a smaller dose of the bacteria. Perhaps it was just random chance. But they lived while their brothers and sisters died. Archibald Tate went on to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest position in the Church of England. But he carried that grief with him for the rest of his life. How could he not? How do you move forward after losing 5 children in 5 weeks? How do you continue to believe in a benevolent God when you have buried more than half your children? These are questions that thousands of Victorian parents had to grapple with. The Tate family's tragedy was extreme, but it was not unique. Scarlet fever epidemics were cyclical, sweeping through communities every few years. Let me give you some statistics that will help you understand the scale of this. In the mid-19th century, scarlet fever was the most common infectious disease among children in both America and Europe. In England and Wales alone, it killed approximately 10,000 children every year. 10,000 every single year. And those are just the recorded deaths. Many deaths in rural areas or poor urban neighborhoods went unrecorded. The true number was almost certainly higher, and here is something that made scarlet fever particularly cruel. Unlike some diseases that primarily affected malnourished children in poverty, scarlet fever seemed to hit everyone equally. Yes, poor children died in greater numbers overall, but wealthy families like the Tates were not protected. This was not a disease you could avoid by moving to a better neighborhood or buying better food. The bacteria did not care about your social class. It spread through schools, through churches, through family gatherings. Anywhere children congregated, scarlet fever could strike. The Victorians tried desperately to understand patterns in scarlet fever outbreaks. They noticed that epidemics seemed to peak in winter and early spring. They noticed that the disease spread more rapidly in crowded conditions, but they did not understand the bacterial cause. Remember, this is before germ theory was fully accepted. So they came up with all sorts of theories. Some thought scarlet fever was caused by miasma from decaying organic matter. Others thought it was spread through contaminated milk. This milk theory was actually partially correct, because unpasteurized milk from infected cows or handled by infected dairy workers could indeed transmit the bacteria. But the Victorians did not understand the mechanism. They just noticed the association. Treatment options were, as with most Victorian diseases, largely ineffective and sometimes harmful. Doctors would recommend isolating the patient, which at least prevented spread to others. They would try to bring down the fever with cool baths or alcohol rubs. They would give patients liquids if they could swallow, trying to prevent dehydration. But there were no antibiotics. There was no antitoxin like there was for diphtheria. You could only provide supportive care and hope. Some doctors still used bloodletting, draining blood from the already weakened child in the mistaken belief that this would help balance the humours or reduce fever. It did neither. It just weakened them further. Other treatments included various herbal concoctions, none of which worked. There were attempts to use quarantine and disinfection to control outbreaks, and these helped somewhat by limiting spread. Families would burn the bedding and clothing of deceased children. They would scrub the sick room with disinfectant. They would keep healthy children away from infected ones. But scarlet fever is highly contagious, spread through respiratory droplets and direct contact. In a household with multiple children, in an era before people understood how to properly prevent disease transmission, it was nearly impossible to stop the spread once it started. Now, I want to tell you about something that shows just how deeply scarlet fever affected Victorian culture. Remember how we talked about post-mortem photography becoming common? Well, scarlet fever deaths contributed significantly to that practice. But there is another aspect of Victorian grief culture that scarlet fever influenced: the cult of the dead child. This sounds dark, and it is, but bear with me because it tells us something important about how people coped with unimaginable loss. Victorian literature, art, and even popular songs were filled with images of dying children, angelic children, beautiful children, children who were too pure for this world and were being called home to heaven. This was not just artistic sentimentality, this was grief processing on a massive cultural scale. When so many families were losing children to diseases like scarlet fever, society needed ways to make sense of these deaths. The idea that children died because they were too good, too pure, too perfect for this fallen world, that at least gave the death some kind of meaning, however painful. But here is the thing about that cultural narrative. While it may have provided some comfort, it also put tremendous pressure on grieving parents, especially mothers. If your child died and you could not find comfort in the idea that they were angels in heaven, if you were just angry and heartbroken and could not see any divine purpose in their suffering, well, then you were seen as lacking in faith. Victorian society expected you to grieve in specific ways, to accept God's will, to find peace in reunion in the afterlife. But how many parents actually felt that peace? How many were just going through the motions while internally screaming at the injustice of it all? There is a reason that Queen Victoria, after her beloved husband Prince Albert died in 1861, went into mourning for the rest of her life. She wore black for 40 years. She understood grief. She understood that you do not just get over losing someone you love. And every parent who lost a child to scarlet fever understood that too. The societal expectation of pious acceptance did not match the reality of devastating loss. But let me tell you about a breakthrough that started to change things. In 1879, the French scientist Louis Pasteur identified the Streptococcus bacteria that causes scarlet fever. This was huge. For the first time, people understood what was actually causing the disease. It was not bad air. It was not divine punishment. It was a specific microorganism that could be studied, understood, and potentially combated. This was the beginning of modern microbiology, and it transformed medicine. But even with this knowledge, an actual cure would not come until much later. It was not until the 1920s and 1930s, with the development of sulfonamide drugs, that doctors had something that could actually kill the bacteria. And then in the 1940s, penicillin and other antibiotics became widely available. Suddenly, scarlet fever transformed from a potential death sentence into a treatable infection. A child who developed scarlet fever could be given antibiotics, and within days they would be recovering. The fever would break, the rash would fade, they would survive. The change was dramatic. By the mid-20th century, scarlet fever had become relatively rare in developed countries, and when it did occur, it was usually mild and easily treated. Deaths became exceptionally unusual. Parents no longer had to live in terror of the disease. It seemed like scarlet fever had been relegated to history, like it was something we read about in Victorian novels but did not have to worry about anymore. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Scarlet fever is coming back. Starting around 2011, cases began to increase dramatically in several countries. Hong Kong experienced an outbreak that quadrupled their normal case numbers. England and Wales saw cases rise to levels not seen in 50 years. By 2016, England was reporting over 19,000 cases annually, compared to just a few thousand in previous decades. What was happening? Scientists are still trying to figure it out completely. The bacteria appears to be evolving. Some strains have become more virulent, better at causing infection and spreading between people. But here is the silver lining, and this is important. These modern strains are not as deadly as the Victorian-era strains were. They still cause scarlet fever, but the mortality rate is much, much lower. Why? Because we have antibiotics. A child who develops scarlet fever today can be treated quickly and effectively. The disease is not the death sentence it once was, but this comeback is still concerning for several reasons. First, it shows us that bacteria are constantly evolving, constantly adapting. We cannot assume that diseases of the past will stay in the past. Second, it reminds us that antibiotic effectiveness depends on proper use. If we overuse antibiotics, if we use them incorrectly, we risk creating resistant strains that do not respond to treatment. And third, it highlights the global inequality in healthcare. In countries with good access to antibiotics and medical care, scarlet fever is manageable. In countries without that access, it can still kill. The Tate family, burying 5 children in 5 weeks, would have given anything for a 10-day course of antibiotics. They would have sacrificed almost anything to save their daughters and sons. And we have that ability now. We have what they desperately needed. But we have to use it wisely. We have to make sure it remains effective. And we have to make sure it is available to everyone who needs it, not just those who can afford it. There is something profoundly humbling about studying Victorian diseases. It reminds us that the medical security we feel is not guaranteed. It is not permanent. It is something that has to be maintained, protected, and extended to all people. The Victorians could not save their children from scarlet fever, but they tried, they researched, they experimented, they learned. And eventually their descendants succeeded in developing treatments that work. We owe it to them, and to ourselves, and to future generations, to not squander that achievement. In just a moment, we are going to shift gears and talk about 2 diseases that the Victorians thought were the same thing, but turned out to be very different. We are going to explore typhus and typhoid, the fever twins that confused everyone. One spread through body lice in filthy conditions, the other through contaminated water. One killed quickly with delirium and rash, the other more slowly with intestinal complications. And we're going to talk about the President of the United States who lost his son to typhoid inside the White House, and how even the most powerful people on Earth were not safe from Victorian diseases. Stay with me, because understanding the difference between these 2 killers shows us just how much medical knowledge advanced during the Victorian era, and how crucial that knowledge was for saving lives. Rest easy, and maybe count your blessings that scarlet fever is no longer the terror it once was. Here is a question that stumped Victorian doctors for decades. Why would 2 people living in the same city, breathing the same air, drinking from different water sources, end up with what seemed like the same fever, but one would break out in a terrible rash and die delirious within days, while the other would seem to recover only to relapse with intestinal complications weeks later? The doctors called both conditions continued fever because they both involved prolonged high temperatures. They thought they were dealing with variations of the same disease, but they were wrong. They were actually dealing with 2 completely different diseases, typhus and typhoid. that happened to have similar names and overlapping symptoms, and this confusion cost thousands of lives because the prevention methods were entirely different. Tonight, we are going to untangle this medical mystery. We are going to talk about the disease spread by body lice in overcrowded slums and the disease spread by contaminated water that killed a president's son inside the White House itself. And we are going to explore how figuring out the difference between these two diseases became crucial to understanding how infections actually spread. Let me start with the easier one to understand: typhus. Typhus is caused by a bacterium called Rickettsia prowazekii, though the Victorians obviously did not know this. What they did observe was that typhus epidemics happened in specific conditions: overcrowded places, prisons, workhouses, military barracks, ships, slums where multiple families lived crammed into single rooms, places where people could not regularly wash their clothes or their bodies, places where, as we would say delicately, personal hygiene was difficult to maintain. The reason for this pattern is actually quite simple, though it took a long time to figure out. Typhus is spread by body lice. Not head lice, not pubic lice, but specifically body lice, the kind that live in clothing, particularly in the seams of unwashed garments. When a person with typhus has the bacteria in their bloodstream, lice that feed on that person's blood become infected. The bacteria multiply in the lice's gut. When the louse bites another person and defecates at the same time, which lice do, charming creatures that they are, the bacteria in the louse feces can enter through the bite wound or through scratches in the skin. And boom, you've got typhus spreading through a population. The symptoms of typhus are distinctive if you know what to look for. High fever, obviously, severe headache, confusion and delirium. And then, a few days into the illness, a rash appears. This rash typically starts on the trunk and spreads outward to the limbs. It consists of small reddish or purplish spots. In severe cases, the fever can get so high that patients become completely delirious, thrashing around, not recognizing family members, speaking nonsense. The mortality rate for untreated typhus can be as high as 20 to 40% depending on the strain and the general health of the patient. Now, the Victorian reformers like Edwin Chadwick, who we talked about way back in the cholera section, they were particularly focused on what they called continued fever, and a lot of what they were seeing was actually typhus. They noticed it clustered in poor neighbourhoods with terrible living conditions. They noticed that improving sanitation, clearing out slums, and providing better housing seemed to reduce fever cases, but they attributed this to removing sources of miasma, bad air. They did not understand the lice connection. So while their interventions worked, better housing did reduce typhus because people could wash their clothes and their bodies more regularly. They succeeded for reasons they did not fully comprehend. Victorian England saw multiple major typhus epidemics. There were outbreaks in 1817 to 1819, another in 1826 to 1827, and again in 1831 to 1832. These coincided with periods of economic hardship and overcrowding in cities as the Industrial Revolution drew people from rural areas into urban centres. Thousands died, and doctors were frustrated because they could see the disease spreading. They could see it killing people, but they could not figure out exactly how it was transmitted. But here is where it gets interesting. Even as typhus was declining in urban England due to better living conditions and public health measures, another disease was persisting and confusing everyone. This was typhoid fever. And unlike typhus, typhoid was spread through contaminated water and food. It is caused by a completely different bacterium, Salmonella typhi. But because it also caused high fever and seemed to drag on for weeks, doctors lumped it together with typhus under the general category of continued fever. Typhoid starts similarly to typhus, high fever, headache, weakness. But the progression is different. The fever typically rises in a stepwise pattern over the first week, reaching very high levels and staying there. Patients develop abdominal pain and often severe constipation initially, followed by diarrhea. Some patients develop rose-colored spots on the trunk, but not the same widespread rash as typhus. And here is the really dangerous part. Typhoid attacks the intestinal tract. In the second or third week of illness, the bacteria can cause ulcers in the small intestine. These ulcers can perforate, meaning they punch through the intestinal wall. When that happens, intestinal contents leak into the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis, which is often fatal. Even patients who seem to be recovering can suddenly take a turn for the worse if perforation occurs. And typhoid had another cruel trick. Some people would recover from the acute illness but become chronic carriers. They would feel fine, go about their lives normally, but they would continue shedding the bacteria in their feces. If these carriers worked in food preparation, or if they contaminated water sources, they could infect dozens or even hundreds of other people without ever knowing they were doing it. The most famous case of this is Typhoid Mary, but she comes later, in the early 20th century. The Victorian era had plenty of unknown carriers spreading the disease. Now, let me tell you a story that shows just how much typhoid did not care about wealth or status. In February of 1862, William Wallace Lincoln, known as Willie, the third son of President Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln, fell ill. Willie was 11 years old, bright, curious, beloved by his parents. He developed a fever. At first, it might have seemed like a common childhood illness. But the fever did not break. It got worse. Willie grew weaker. He became delirious. His parents sat by his bedside in the White House, the most powerful residence in America, and watched their son dying of a disease that was likely caused by contaminated water from the Potomac River, which supplied the White House. Think about the irony of that. The President of the United States, leading the nation through a civil war, could not protect his own child from a waterborne disease. All the power, all the resources, all the medical care they could summon, and Willie Lincoln died on February 20th, 1862. Lincoln was described by witnesses as convulsed with grief, completely unnerved. His wife Mary was inconsolable. They had lost a child to a preventable disease in the seat of American power, and Willie's death was not unique among prominent families. Typhoid swept through rich neighborhoods and poor ones alike because contaminated water did not discriminate. A wealthy home might have beautiful plumbing, but if the water supply was tainted, everyone who drank from it was at risk. And in the mid-19th century, many water supplies were tainted. Remember our friend the Thames from the cholera section? Same problem, different bacteria. The confusion between typhus and typhoid persisted for decades because the symptoms overlapped enough that doctors could not reliably distinguish them, especially in the early stages. It was not until the later Victorian period, as bacteriology developed, that scientists began to understand these were separate diseases with different causes and different transmission methods. The typhoid bacterium was identified in the 1880 OS. The connection between typhus and lice was confirmed around the same time, and suddenly prevention strategies could be tailored to each specific disease. For typhus, the answer was improving living conditions, providing facilities for washing clothes and bodies, reducing overcrowding. Basically making it harder for body lice to thrive and spread. And it worked. As Victorian cities improved their housing stock, as public baths became more common, as working-class people gained better access to clean clothing, typhus cases dropped dramatically. By the late 19th century, typhus had gone from a major killer to a relatively rare disease in Britain. It did not disappear completely. It would make comebacks during wartime when sanitation broke down, but it was no longer the constant threat it had been. For typhoid, the solution was clean water and proper sewage disposal. The same infrastructure projects that reduced cholera also reduced typhoid. Joseph Bazalgette's London sewers, The ones we talked about that were built after the Great Stink, they did not just protect against cholera, they protected against typhoid too. And as water treatment improved, as cities learned to separate their drinking water from their sewage, typhoid cases fell. It was not instant. Typhoid persisted longer than typhus because water infrastructure took time to build and maintain. But slowly, steadily, the disease retreated. There is something fascinating about how these two diseases, so different in their transmission, were confused for so long. And it tells us something important about how medical knowledge advances. It is not usually through sudden, brilliant insights. It is through careful observation, patient documentation, statistical analysis, and sometimes just getting lucky and noticing the right pattern at the right time. The Victorians knew that continued fever was associated with poverty. They knew it was associated with bad living conditions, but they did not know whether the problem was the air, the water, the crowding, the filth, or some combination of all of these. So they tried to improve everything, and that scattershot approach actually worked better than a narrowly focused one might have, because they were unknowingly addressing multiple different diseases at once. But here is where I need to give credit where it is due. The Victorian sanitarians, for all their mistakes about miasma theory, they saved countless lives. Edwin Chadwick and his colleagues pushed for better housing, better sanitation, better water supplies. They compiled statistics showing that poor neighbourhoods had much higher death rates than wealthy ones. They made the case that society had a moral and practical obligation to improve living conditions. And even though they did not fully understand germ theory, their reforms worked because they addressed the actual conditions in which disease-causing bacteria thrived. By the time the Victorian era ended, both typhus and typhoid were in retreat in Britain and other industrialised nations. Not eliminated, that would take longer, but dramatically reduced. And the key was infrastructure. Sewers, clean water systems, better housing, public health measures. These were not glamorous medical breakthroughs like discovering antibiotics. They were boring, expensive, bureaucratic projects that took decades to complete, but they probably saved more lives than any individual medical treatment of the Victorian era. I want you to think about what we take for granted. When you turn on your tap and clean water comes out, that is the legacy of Victorian public health reformers. When sewage disappears into pipes and you never have to think about where it goes, that is infrastructure that took generations to build. When you live in a home that is not overcrowded, where you can wash your clothes and your body regularly, where you do not have to share close quarters with people who might be carrying disease, that is partly the result of Victorian-era reforms that established minimum housing standards. And yet typhus and typhoid have not disappeared globally, they are still with us. Typhus still occurs in places where people live in overcrowded conditions without access to washing facilities, refugee camps, disaster zones, areas of extreme poverty. Typhoid still occurs in places without clean water and proper sanitation, parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America. The World Health Organization estimates that typhoid alone still causes 11 to 20 million cases and over 100,000 deaths each year globally. 100,000 people dying from a disease that we know exactly how to prevent. That is the inequity of global health in a nutshell. And here is something that should concern all of us. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw how quickly disease prevention systems can break down. We saw supply chains disrupted. We saw healthcare systems overwhelmed. We saw in some places sanitation and infrastructure maintenance delayed. When systems break down, old diseases can come back. We cannot assume that typhus and typhoid will stay in the history books. They are only in the history books for wealthy countries that maintain their public health infrastructure. For much of the world, they are current threats. The Victorian struggle with typhus and typhoid teaches us that controlling infectious disease is not just about medicine. It is about infrastructure, about social conditions, about inequality. You can have the best doctors and the best hospitals in the world, but if people do not have clean water and decent housing, disease will spread. Willie Lincoln died in the White House because the White House used contaminated water. What chance did poor families have? Now, we're about to shift to a disease that has a very different character from the ones we have discussed so far. We are going to talk about smallpox, the disease that used to kill 400,000 Europeans every year and cause 1/3 of all cases of blindness. But we're also going to talk about one of medicine's greatest triumphs, because smallpox is the only human disease we have ever completely eradicated from the planet. We are going to explore Edward Jenner's vaccine, the anti-vaccine movement of the Victorian era. Yes, there was one, and the 200-year campaign that finally wiped out a disease that had plagued humanity since ancient times. This is a story with a happy ending, but it is also a story about how hard people fought against the very thing that would save them. Stay close, because the smallpox story is one of the most important medical narratives in human history. Sleep well, and maybe take a moment to appreciate your access to clean water and uncrowded living space. I want to tell you about the only disease in human history that we have completely destroyed. Not controlled, not reduced, not managed, destroyed, eradicated from the face of the earth, gone forever. The last naturally occurring case was in 1977 in Somalia. Since 1980, not a single human being has contracted smallpox from nature. Think about that for a moment. A disease that killed an estimated 300 million people in the 20th century alone. A disease that caused approximately 1/3 of all blindness in the world. A disease so terrible that survivors would often be left with their faces completely covered in deep pitted scars. And we killed it. Humanity, working together across nations and ideologies and centuries, killed this disease. But the story of how we did it starts in the Victorian era, with a country doctor in England who noticed something interesting about milkmaids. And it involves one of the most passionate fights in medical history, not between doctors and disease, but between doctors and the people they were trying to save. Because yes, there was an anti-vaccine movement in Victorian England, and it nearly derailed one of humanity's greatest achievements. Let me start by telling you what smallpox actually did, because we need to understand why this disease was so feared. Smallpox was caused by the variola virus, which came in two main forms. Variola major was the really nasty one, with mortality rates of 30% or higher. Variola minor was less deadly but still horrible. The virus spread through the air, through respiratory droplets, and sometimes through contact with contaminated objects like bedding or clothing. It was incredibly contagious. If you were in a room with someone who had smallpox, you had a very high chance of getting it yourself. The disease started like many others: fever, headache, body aches, but then came the characteristic feature, the rash. It would begin in the mouth and throat, then spread to the face and then cover the entire body. But this was not like the rashes we have talked about with other diseases. Smallpox pustules were raised, firm, deeply embedded in the skin. They were filled with thick fluid. They covered every inch of the body, the face, the scalp, the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, inside the mouth, even the eyes. The person would be in agony. The pustules would be intensely painful. Eating would be torture. Swallowing would be agony. And then, in the worst cases, the pustules would merge together into sheets of infected tissue. This was called confluent smallpox, and it was usually fatal. If you survived, and remember 30% or more did not, the pustules would eventually scab over and fall off. But they left scars. Deep permanent pockmarks all over your body. The face would often be completely disfigured. Some survivors lost their noses as the tissue died and fell away. Many were blinded because the virus attacked the cornea. Survivors would often be left deaf or with damaged joints, and there was no treatment, nothing that worked. You could only isolate the patient, try to keep them comfortable, and hope. Smallpox had been devastating humanity for millennia. It was described in ancient texts from Egypt, India, and China. It probably killed more people throughout history than any other infectious disease. In the 18th century, smallpox killed an estimated 400,000 Europeans every year. 400,000 every single year. It killed monarchs and peasants alike. It contributed to the collapse of indigenous populations in the Americas after European contact because Native Americans had no immunity to it. The disease was a constant, terrifying presence in human life. But here is where our story really begins. In the late 1700s, people in various parts of the world had noticed something interesting. Milkmaids, women who milked cows for a living, seemed to rarely get smallpox, and when they did, it was usually mild. This was such a commonly observed phenomenon that it entered folklore. Milkmaids were famous for having clear, unblemished skin, in an era when pockmarked faces were extremely common. The question was, why? Enter Edward Jenner, a country doctor in Gloucestershire, England. Jenner heard the folk wisdom about milkmaids and decided to investigate scientifically. He learned that milkmaids often contracted a disease called cowpox from the cows they worked with. Cowpox caused pustules on the hands, much like smallpox, but much milder. It rarely caused serious illness and never caused the facial scarring that smallpox did. Jenner formed a hypothesis. What if exposure to cowpox somehow protected against smallpox? In 1796, Jenner decided to test his theory. And this is where the story gets ethically complicated from a modern perspective. Jenner took pus from a cowpox pustule on the hand of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and deliberately infected an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. The boy developed cowpox, felt mildly unwell for a few days and recovered. Then, and this is the part that would never be allowed today, Jenner deliberately exposed James to smallpox. He inoculated the boy with actual smallpox material, expecting him to be protected by the previous cowpox exposure, and James did not develop smallpox. He was immune. Now, let me be clear. What Jenner did would be considered wildly unethical today. You cannot just experiment on children like that. But in 1796, medical ethics were very different, and Jenner believed he was onto something that could save countless lives. And he was right. He called his technique vaccination, from vacca, the Latin word for cow, vaccination from cows. Over the next few years, Jenner refined his technique and published his results. The medical community was skeptical at first, but as more and more people were successfully vaccinated, and as smallpox cases dropped in vaccinated populations, the evidence became overwhelming. Vaccination worked. By the time Queen Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837, vaccination was becoming widespread in Britain. But here is the thing, it was not mandatory, it was voluntary. And not everyone was convinced it was a good idea, despite the clear evidence that vaccination prevented smallpox. Despite the thousands of lives being saved, there was significant resistance. And this resistance came from various quarters for various reasons. Some people did not trust the medical establishment. Some had religious objections, believing that it was interfering with divine will. Some were concerned about the safety of putting cow material into human bodies. And some just did not like the government telling them what to do with their children. The anti-vaccine movement in Victorian England was vocal, organised and passionate. They formed leagues and published pamphlets. They held rallies. They argued that vaccination was ineffective, dangerous and an infringement on personal liberty. Does any of this sound familiar? The arguments used by Victorian anti-vaxxers are remarkably similar to those used today. They pointed to cases where vaccinated people still got smallpox, which could happen if the vaccine was administered improperly or if immunity waned. They highlighted rare complications from vaccination, which did exist, though they were far less dangerous than smallpox itself. They framed it as government overreach, as medical tyranny. In 1853, the British government made vaccination compulsory for infants, and the backlash was fierce. The Anti-Vaccination League and other organisations fought hard against the law. There were protests. There were parents who refused to vaccinate their children and were fined or imprisoned for it. The resistance was so strong that in 1898, the government had to pass a new law allowing for conscientious objection. Basically, if you really truly objected to vaccination, you could opt out. The concept of the conscientious objector to medical procedures was born from the anti-vaccine movement, but here is what the numbers show. In the period before widespread vaccination, smallpox killed tens of thousands of people in Britain every year. After vaccination became common, those numbers dropped dramatically. Between 1837 and 1840, when Victoria's reign began, there were still over 40,000 deaths from smallpox in England and Wales. But as vaccination rates increased over the following decades, deaths plummeted. By the early 20th century, smallpox was rare in Britain. Rare. Not because the virus had changed, but because people were protected. And yet, the anti-vaccine movement persisted. Even as the evidence mounted, even as smallpox deaths dropped to near zero in vaccinated populations while unvaccinated populations continued to suffer outbreaks, there were people who insisted vaccination was wrong or dangerous or unnecessary. This created a tragedy of the common situation. When most people are vaccinated, even the unvaccinated are somewhat protected because the disease cannot spread easily through a highly immune population. This is called herd immunity. But if too many people refuse vaccination, that protection breaks down and outbreaks can occur. Victorian health officials understood this. Even if they did not use the term herd immunity, they knew that vaccination had to be widespread to be effective. I want to tell you about one particular smallpox outbreak that illustrates this perfectly. In 1870 to 1873, Europe experienced a major smallpox epidemic. It coincided with the Franco-Prussian War, which created perfect conditions for disease spread. Mass movements of troops, disruption of normal life, overcrowding, poor sanitation. The epidemic killed an estimated 500,000 people across Europe. But the death toll varied dramatically by country. In Germany, which had strict vaccination laws and high compliance, the death rate was relatively low. In France, which had lower vaccination rates and less enforcement, the death toll was much higher. The evidence was clear. Vaccination worked at a population level, but even this was not enough to convince everyone. The anti-vaccine movement continued to argue that other factors were responsible for the differences in death rates. They attributed Germany's lower death toll to better nutrition, better sanitation, better general health, anything except vaccination. And yes, those other factors did matter. People who were well-nourished and healthy were more likely to survive smallpox if they contracted it, but they were still far more likely to not contract it at all if they were vaccinated. Fast forward to the 20th century. By the 1950s and 60s, smallpox had been eliminated from most wealthy countries through sustained vaccination programs, but it persisted in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. And this is where the story becomes truly inspiring. In 1967, the World Health Organization launched an intensified global campaign to eradicate smallpox entirely. Not just control it, not just reduce it, eradicate it completely from the entire planet. This was an audacious goal. It required coordinating efforts across dozens of countries with different political systems, different levels of resources, different cultural attitudes toward vaccination. It required training thousands of health workers. It required developing new strategies for reaching remote populations. It required something called ring vaccination, where every case of smallpox was surrounded by a ring of vaccinated people to prevent further spread. And it required persistence. The campaign took 10 years of intensive effort, but it worked. Case by case, region by region, country by country, smallpox was pushed back. The last case in Asia was in Bangladesh in 1975. The last case in South America was in Brazil in 1971. And the final holdout was the Horn of Africa. The very last naturally occurring case of smallpox was a hospital cook in Somalia named Ali Mau Marlin, who contracted the disease in October of 1977. He survived. And after that, no more cases appeared. Teams of health workers searched the region intensively for any sign of the disease. They checked thousands of people. They investigated every rumor of a pox-like illness. Nothing. The virus was gone. On May 8, 1980, the World Health Organization officially declared that smallpox had been eradicated from nature. Humanity had won. A disease that had killed and disfigured for thousands of years had been eliminated. It remains the only infectious disease affecting humans that has been completely eradicated. Not polio, we are close, but not there yet. Not measles, not malaria, not tuberculosis. Just smallpox. And it all started with Edward Jenner and a milkmaid and an 8-year-old boy in 1796. Think about what this means. Every child born after 1980 has lived in a world without the threat of smallpox. They will never see a smallpox patient. They will never have to fear the disease. They will never carry the pockmarked scars that were once so common. And this is not because the virus evolved to become less dangerous. It is not because humans developed natural immunity. It is because humans deliberately, systematically, persistently use vaccination to drive the virus to extinction. We did that. Science did that. Public health did that. But here is the uncomfortable truth. The eradication of smallpox required mandatory vaccination programs in many places. It required overriding individual objections for the collective good. It required recognizing that some diseases are so dangerous and so contagious that we cannot afford to let them circulate while we respect everyone's personal choice not to be vaccinated. This is a difficult balance. Personal autonomy matters. Medical freedom matters. But so does protecting children from preventable diseases. So does preventing epidemics that could kill thousands. The Victorians struggled with this balance just as we do today. They had passionate debates about the ethics of mandatory vaccination. They wrestled with the tension between individual rights and public health. And ultimately they came down on the side of vaccination because the alternative, allowing smallpox to continue killing 400,000 people per year, was unacceptable. History has proven them right, and yet here we are in the 21st century, having the same arguments all over again, about measles, about whooping cough, about diseases that we have safe, effective vaccines for. We have forgotten what these diseases do because vaccination has been so successful. We have the luxury of debating vaccine safety because we do not see children dying of measles or whooping themselves to death from pertussis. The Victorians did not have that luxury. They saw the bodies. They buried the children. And they fought hard for the right to use vaccination to protect future generations. I'm not saying the Victorian approach was perfect. Medical autonomy and informed consent are important principles that were not always respected in the past. But I am saying that we should remember what was at stake, and we should remember that the eradication of smallpox stands as proof that vaccination, when widely applied, can literally eliminate diseases from the face of the earth. Now we are going to shift our focus to a category of diseases that the Victorians called childhood diseases, the common killers that parents just expected to face. We are going to talk about measles, whooping cough, and the heartbreaking reality that 40 to 50% of children did not survive to their 5th birthday in the 19th century. We are going to explore why these common diseases were so deadly, what treatments existed or did not exist, and why the survival rate for children changed so dramatically in just a few generations. This next section is about the normalcy of childhood death in Victorian times, and how extraordinary it is that we now consider childhood death to be a rare tragedy rather than an expected part of life. Stay with me, because this perspective shift is crucial for understanding just how much has changed and how fragile those changes are. Rest well, and maybe say a quiet thanks that you will never have to worry about smallpox. Try to imagine this for a moment. You are a Victorian parent with 6 children. Statistically, 3 of them will not live to see their 5th birthday. Not because of a single catastrophic event, not because of war or famine, just because they are children living in the 19th century, and that is what happens to children. Half of them die. This was not considered a tragedy of unusual proportions. This was normal, expected, the background reality of life. Victorian parents did not ask, "Will I lose a child?" They asked, "Which ones will I lose and when?" Tonight, we are going to talk about the diseases that made childhood so dangerous, measles, whooping cough, and others that we now think of as minor inconveniences because we have forgotten what they used to do. We are going to explore why being a Victorian child was so perilous, and why the fact that most children today survive to adulthood is not natural or inevitable, but rather an extraordinary achievement that required centuries of effort. And we're going to confront an uncomfortable question. Have we become so successful at saving children that we have forgotten why we needed to save them in the first place? Let me start with a disease that most people today think of as no big deal: measles. Oh, measles, you get a rash and stay home from school for a week. Right, wrong. Modern measles is mild because we have good nutrition, decent healthcare, and antibiotics to treat secondary infections. Victorian measles was a killer. Between 1838 and 1840, measles and whooping cough together killed 50,000 people in England and Wales. 50,000 in just 2 years. And the overwhelming majority of them were children under 5. Here is what measles actually does. It starts with high fever, cough, runny nose, and inflamed eyes. Then comes the characteristic rash, red spots that start on the face and spread down the body. But the real danger is not the rash. The real danger is that the measles virus suppresses the immune system for weeks or even months after the infection. During this time, children are vulnerable to everything else: pneumonia, diarrhea, ear infections that can lead to deafness, encephalitis, swelling of the brain, which can cause seizures, brain damage, and death. Before the measles vaccine, measles was one of the leading causes of childhood death worldwide. Not just in Victorian England, everywhere. And the Victorians had no effective treatment. They would try to keep the fever down with cool compresses. They would keep the child in a darkened room because the inflamed eyes were sensitive to light. They would try to get fluids into them. But if complications developed, if pneumonia set in or the brain swelled, there was nothing they could do. They could only watch and hope and pray. And often it was not enough. Now let me tell you about whooping cough, also called pertussis. This disease has one of the most distinctive symptoms in medicine, the whoop. Children with whooping cough develop severe coughing fits that go on until they run out of air, and then they inhale sharply with a high-pitched whooping sound. These coughing fits can be so violent that children vomit, break ribs, or pass out from lack of oxygen. In infants, the disease is even worse, because they do not always whoop. They just stop breathing. Their airways get clogged with thick mucus, and they cannot clear it on their own. Parents would sit up all night watching their infant, ready to try to clear the airway if the baby stopped breathing. Can you imagine that level of vigilance, that level of fear? Whooping cough could last for months. Yes, months. The Chinese called it the 100-day cough because it went on for so long. Victorian children would cough for weeks on end, barely able to eat or sleep, exhausting themselves with the effort of breathing. And there was no cure. Some doctors recommended fresh air. Some recommended various tonics or syrups. None of it really worked. The only thing that helped was time, and many children did not have enough time. They would die of exhaustion, malnutrition, or secondary infections before the disease ran its course. But here is something that makes this even more heartbreaking. Many of these childhood disease deaths happened in clusters. A disease would come to a neighbourhood, and it would sweep through family after family. Remember the Tate family from the Scarlet Fever section? 5 children dead in 40 days. That kind of cascading loss was not rare. Families would lose multiple children in a single epidemic. And because these diseases spread so easily among children, having more children actually increased your risk of losing more children. They would infect each other. A sick older child would pass the disease to a younger sibling who was often more vulnerable. Victorian parents lived with the level of anxiety that is hard for us to comprehend. Every fever, every cough, every rash could be the beginning of something fatal. And they had no way to prevent it. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no real understanding of how diseases spread or what caused them. They would try folk remedies passed down through generations. They would pray. They would follow whatever medical advice was available, even when that advice was useless or harmful. And then they would wait to see if their child would be one of the survivors or one of the statistics. The psychological toll of this must have been enormous. How do you bond with a child when you know there is almost a 50% chance they will die before they can walk or talk properly? Some historians have suggested that Victorian parents emotionally distanced themselves from young children as a protective mechanism. But I think that is too simple. Yes, infant mortality was high. Yes, parents knew the risks, but that does not mean they loved their children less. The grief literature of the Victorian era is full of anguished accounts of parents mourning children who died young. They loved their children desperately. They just had to live with a level of loss that would be considered unbearable today. And here is something that might surprise you. Wealthy children died too. Money helped. Better nutrition, cleaner living conditions, access to doctors. But it did not provide immunity. Disease did not check your bank balance before infecting you. The difference was that wealthy families could afford to have more children as a kind of insurance policy. If you had 8 or 9 children, the odds were good that at least some would survive to adulthood. Poor families could not afford that strategy. They might have 4 or 5 children, lose half of them, and be left with 1 or 2 surviving offspring. The emotional and economic impact was devastating. Let me give you some statistics that really drive this home. In Victorian England, the infant mortality rate, that is, children dying before their first birthday, was around 150 deaths per 1,000 live births in the mid-19th century. That is 15%. Nearly 1 in 6 babies died before reaching 1 year old. And the under 5 mortality rate was even worse, somewhere between 40 and 50% in many areas. Nearly half of all children born would not see their 5th birthday. Compare that to today. In the United Kingdom, the infant mortality rate is now less than 4 per 1,000, less than half of 1%, and the under 5 mortality rate is even lower. The change is staggering. We have gone from losing nearly half our children to losing less than 1%. That did not happen by accident. It happened because of vaccines, antibiotics, better nutrition, cleaner water, improved sanitation, and a healthcare system that knows how to treat childhood illnesses. But I want to focus on vaccines for a moment because they are so crucial to this story. The measles vaccine was developed in the 1960s. Before that vaccine, measles infected nearly every child in America by age 15, nearly every single one. There were millions of cases every year and hundreds of deaths. After the vaccine was introduced and widely adopted, measles cases in the United States dropped by 99%, and measles deaths became so rare that many doctors never saw a case in their entire careers. The whooping cough vaccine, developed in the 1940s, had a similar impact. Before the vaccine, whooping cough killed thousands of American children every year. After the vaccine, deaths dropped to single digits annually. Not hundreds, not dozens, single digits. That is the power of vaccination at a population level. But here is where we get to an uncomfortable truth. Because these vaccines have been so successful, many people today have never seen what measles or whooping cough actually do. They have never watched a child gasp for breath during a whooping cough fit. They have never seen a child's brain swell from measles encephalitis. They have the luxury of thinking these diseases are not that bad because the diseases are now rare. But the diseases are only rare because of vaccination. Remove the vaccines and the diseases come roaring back. We have seen this happen. In communities where vaccination rates have dropped due to anti-vaccine sentiment, we have seen outbreaks of measles, whooping cough, and other vaccine-preventable diseases. Children who could have been protected end up getting sick. Some end up hospitalized, some die, and it is preventable. It is entirely, completely preventable. The Victorians would have killed for these vaccines. They would have done anything to protect their children from the diseases that killed half of them. And we have those vaccines, safe and effective and available. And some people are choosing not to use them. I'm not trying to shame anyone here. I'm just trying to provide historical perspective. Victorian parents buried children at a rate we can barely comprehend. They lived with constant fear and constant grief, and we have the tools to prevent that. The tools that millions of people worked on for centuries. Scientists who spent their lives developing vaccines. Public health workers who organized vaccination campaigns. Parents who demanded better health care for their children. We are the beneficiaries of all that effort. And the Victorian parents who lost children to measles and whooping cough and diphtheria and scarlet fever would look at our time with wonder and envy. They would say, "You can prevent this. You can save these children, and you are choosing not to." Let me tell you about one more aspect of Victorian childhood mortality that I think is important. The class divide. Poor children died at much higher rates than wealthy children. Not just because of disease, but because of malnutrition, unsafe working conditions. Yes, children worked in Victorian England, often in dangerous jobs, lack of access to healthcare, and overcrowded housing. A child born into a wealthy family in Victorian London might have a 70 or 80% chance of surviving to adulthood. A child born into a slum in the same city might have only a 40% chance. Same city, same time period, completely different outcomes based purely on economic circumstances. And you know what? That divide still exists globally. In wealthy countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, childhood mortality is now very low. But in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, under 5 mortality rates can still reach 10 or 15% or higher. Not 50% like Victorian England, but still devastatingly high. These are often deaths from diseases we know how to prevent and treat. Measles, diarrhea, pneumonia, malaria. We have the vaccines, the antibiotics, the oral rehydration solutions, the mosquito nets. But millions of children do not have access to them because of poverty, conflict, and inequality. So when we talk about the Victorian childhood experience, we are not just talking about history, we are talking about a reality that still exists for hundreds of millions of children around the world. The only difference is geography. A child born in Oslo has a completely different life expectancy than a child born in Lagos, not because Norwegian children are inherently healthier, but because Norway has the infrastructure, the healthcare system, the wealth to protect its children. Victorian England eventually developed that capacity. Wealthy countries today have that capacity, but much of the world does not, and that is a moral challenge we are still grappling with. The Victorians made enormous progress during their era. They went from not understanding what caused disease to developing germ theory. They went from having no effective treatments to developing antitoxins and eventually antibiotics. They went from accepting child mortality as inevitable to fighting it systematically. Child mortality rates did drop during the Victorian period, especially in the later decades as public health measures took effect. But the really dramatic improvements came in the 20th century, with vaccines and antibiotics and modern medicine. That is when childhood death went from common to rare. And that is what I want you to take away from this section. The fact that most children today survive to adulthood is not natural. It is not inevitable. It is not something we can take for granted. It is an achievement, a hard-won, fragile achievement that requires constant maintenance. It requires keeping up vaccination rates. It requires maintaining public health infrastructure. It requires funding healthcare systems. It requires remembering why these things matter in the first place. The Victorian parents who lost half their children did not have a choice. We do. We can choose to protect our children with every tool we have available. Or we can choose to forget the lessons of history and allow preventable diseases to return. The choice seems obvious to me. But then, I have read the Victorian grief literature. I have studied the statistics. I know what we are risking if we make the wrong choice. Next, we're going to talk about a disease that the Victorians did not fully understand, but that shaped their society in profound ways. We're going to explore rickets, the disease of industrial darkness that twisted children's bones because they were not getting enough sunlight. We are going to talk about why industrialization, for all its economic benefits, created health problems that had never existed before. And we are going to explore the ironic fact that rickets, which should be a disease of the past, is making a comeback in the 21st century. Stay close, because the rickets story shows us how economic progress can create health problems, and how forgetting the past leaves us vulnerable to repeating it. Rest well tonight, and if you have children, maybe go check on them. Just because you can. Picture a child who has never seen direct sunlight. Not because they live in a cave, not because they are imprisoned, but because they work 14 hours a day in a textile mill or a coal mine, and by the time they emerge, the sun has already set. This child's legs are bowed. Their spine curves unnaturally. Their chest is deformed. Their skull is soft in places where it should be hard. They are in constant pain. And this is not some medieval torture scenario. This is industrial progress. This is Victorian England at the height of its economic power. Tonight, we are going to talk about rickets, the disease that was so common in industrial cities that bowed legs and hunched backs were just accepted as normal features of the working class. We are going to explore how humanity built factories that generated enormous wealth while simultaneously creating a disease that had barely existed before. And we're going to confront an ironic and frustrating truth. Rickets, which we completely understand and know exactly how to prevent, is making a comeback in the 21st century. Same disease, different reasons, same twisted bones. Let me start by explaining what rickets actually is, because it is unlike most of the diseases we have talked about. Rickets is not caused by bacteria or viruses. It is not contagious. You cannot catch it from someone else. Rickets is a deficiency disease. Specifically, it is caused by a lack of vitamin D, which leads to inadequate calcium absorption, which results in bones that do not mineralize properly. Without enough vitamin D, a child's growing bones become soft and weak. And because bones are still developing and are under constant stress from weight and movement, they deform. They bend and twist in ways bones should never bend and twist. The symptoms of rickets are visible and unmistakable. The long bones of the legs bow outward or inward under the weight of the body, creating the characteristic bowed legs. The ribs develop bumps where the cartilage meets the bone, creating what doctors called a rachitic rosary because the bumps look like beads on a rosary necklace. The spine can curve abnormally. The pelvis can become deformed, which would cause terrible problems for girls when they grew up and tried to give birth. The skull can develop soft spots even after the normal infant fontanelles have closed. Children with rickets often have delayed motor development because their bones hurt and do not support their weight properly. They might not walk until much later than normal. They might never walk normally at all. And here is the thing that makes this particularly cruel. Rickets is almost entirely preventable. The human body can make its own vitamin D. All it needs is exposure to sunlight. When ultraviolet B rays from the sun hit your skin, they trigger a chemical reaction that produces vitamin D. Just 15 to 20 minutes of sunlight on your skin a few times a week is usually enough. 15 to 20 minutes, that is it. But Victorian working-class children were not getting 15 to 20 minutes of sunlight. They were lucky if they saw the sun at all. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain from a primarily agricultural society to an industrial one at breathtaking speed. In 1750, most people lived in rural areas and worked outdoors. By 1850, the majority lived in cities and worked indoors. Factories, workshops, mines, these were the new workplaces, and they employed everyone, including children. Children as young as 5 or 6 years old would work in textile mills, coal mines, factories. They would start before dawn and finish after sunset. During winter months, they might go weeks without seeing direct sunlight. But it was not just the work hours, it was also where they lived. Industrial cities grew so rapidly that housing could not keep up. Workers were crammed into dense slums where buildings blocked out the sky. Streets were narrow. Buildings were tall and packed tightly together. Even on their days off, children might not get adequate sun exposure because the urban environment itself was designed in a way that blocked sunlight. And then there was the pollution. Industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham and London were covered in a constant pall of coal smoke. The smoke literally blocked the sunlight from reaching the ground. Victorian London was famous for its fog, but much of what people called fog was actually industrial smog so thick you could barely see across the street. How much vitamin D producing ultraviolet light do you think was getting through that? And one more factor, skin colour. Darker skin is better adapted to intense sunlight because the melanin provides protection against UV damage. But that same melanin also makes vitamin D production less efficient. In Africa, where humans with dark skin evolved, this is not a problem because there is plenty of sunlight. But in northern England, where sunlight is already limited, and where industrial smog blocks even more of it, people with darker skin need even more sun exposure to produce adequate vitamin D. This is why rickets became particularly severe among immigrant communities from India and Africa in British industrial cities. It was not that they were more prone to the disease inherently, it was that the environmental conditions were even worse for them. Let me give you some statistics to show just how widespread rickets was. In some Victorian slums, rickets affected up to half of all children. Half! It was so common that bowed legs were considered a normal feature of the working class. If you saw a child with straight legs in a poor neighborhood, people might assume their family had money or that they worked outdoors. Deformed bones were the visible mark of poverty and indoor labor, and because the bone deformities were permanent, adults who had suffered from rickets as children carried the evidence of their childhood deprivation for their entire lives. The medical community struggled to understand what caused rickets for a long time. They could see that it affected poor children more than wealthy ones. They could see that it was more common in industrial cities than in rural areas. But they did not understand why. Some thought it was related to poor diet in general. Some thought it was related to lack of fresh air. Some thought it was genetic or hereditary. It was not until the early 1900s that researchers began to figure out that sunlight and certain nutrients were involved. And it was not until the 1920s that vitamin D itself was identified and understood. But here is something interesting. Even before they understood the mechanism, some doctors and social reformers noticed that certain interventions seemed to help. Cod liver oil, for instance, was found to be beneficial for children with rickets. They did not know why. Cod liver oil is rich in vitamin D, but they had not identified vitamin D yet. But they could observe that it helped. So it became a common remedy. If you've ever heard stories about grandparents being forced to take cod liver oil as children and hating the taste, this is why. It was prescribed for rickets prevention, and it worked, even though nobody understood the mechanism until decades later. Similarly, some reformers advocated for public parks, for access to outdoor spaces, for limiting child labor hours. They made moral and humanitarian arguments, but they were also inadvertently addressing the rickets problem. Getting children outside into the sun, even for short periods, made a difference. The Victorian public health reforms that improved housing, that created parks, that eventually restricted child labour, these all helped reduce rickets, even though the reformers were not specifically targeting the disease. But rickets was not completely eliminated until the 20th century, when two major developments occurred. First, vitamin D was identified, and its role in bone health was understood. This allowed for targeted interventions. Second, food fortification became common. In many countries, milk and other foods began to be fortified with vitamin D. This meant that even children who did not get much sun exposure could still get adequate vitamin D from their diet. The combination of better understanding, food fortification, and improved living conditions meant that rickets went from being widespread to becoming rare in wealthy countries by the mid-20th century. And here is where the story should end, right? Medical science solved the problem. Rickets became a disease of the past relegated to history books and Victorian novels, except it did not stay in the past. Starting in the late 20th century and continuing into the 21st, rickets has been making a comeback. Not at Victorian levels, but the increase is real and concerning. Why? Several reasons, and they are frustratingly preventable. First, modern lifestyle changes mean children spend less time outdoors than previous generations. They are inside watching television, playing video games, using computers. Even when they go outside, they are often slathered in sunscreen, which blocks the very UV rays needed for vitamin D production. Now, do not misunderstand me. Skin cancer is real, and sun protection is important. But we have perhaps overcorrected in a way that creates its own problems. 15 minutes of sun exposure on your arms and face without sunscreen, a few times a week, is generally safe and beneficial, but many children are not getting even that. Second, dietary changes. Many people have moved away from vitamin D-rich foods or from fortified dairy products. Whether due to lactose intolerance, veganism, or just changing food preferences, some children are not getting enough vitamin D from their diet. And if they are not getting it from food and not getting it from sunlight, where are they getting it? They are not. Third, and this is particularly concerning, rickets is reappearing in immigrant communities in northern countries for the same reason it affected them in Victorian times. People with darker skin living in northern latitudes need more sun exposure to produce adequate vitamin D. If they are also spending most of their time indoors, and if their diet does not include vitamin D fortified foods, perhaps for cultural or religious reasons, they are at high risk. We are seeing cases of rickets among Somali children in Minnesota, among Pakistani children in England, among various immigrant communities in Scandinavia. It is the Victorian pattern repeating itself. And fourth, there is sometimes a lack of awareness among healthcare providers. Because rickets became so rare for a few decades, some doctors today have never seen a case and might not recognize it immediately. Parents might not know to supplement with vitamin D, especially if they live in cloudy climates or if their children have limited sun exposure. The knowledge that was so hard won in the early 20th century has been partially forgotten. The irony here is painful. We know exactly what causes rickets. We know exactly how to prevent it. Adequate vitamin D from sunlight or diet or supplements, that is it. That is the entire prevention strategy. It is cheap, it is simple, it is completely effective. And yet children are still developing rickets in wealthy countries in the 21st century. Not because we lack the knowledge or the resources, but because we have become complacent. We have forgotten that this disease exists and that it requires active prevention. I want you to think about what rickets represents. It is a visible physical manifestation of social and economic conditions. Victorian rickets showed us what happens when economic progress, the factories, the industrial growth, the wealth generation comes at the expense of basic human health. Those bowed legs, those curved spines, they were the price children paid for Britain's industrial dominance. And we looked at that price and said, this is too high, we need to change this. And we did change it. We passed labour laws, we improved housing, we learned about nutrition, we took action. But modern rickets shows us something else. It shows us that even when we have the knowledge, even when we have the resources, we still have to pay attention. We still have to take action. We cannot just assume that diseases of the past will stay in the past. Rickets did not go away because the rickets bacteria evolved, or because humans developed natural immunity. There is no rickets bacteria, there is no immunity to develop. Rickets went away because we changed social conditions and we ensured adequate nutrition. And if we stop doing those things, if we forget why they matter, the disease comes back. There is something deeply frustrating about preventable diseases. With infectious diseases, at least you can tell yourself that we need new scientific discoveries, new medicines, new vaccines. But with rickets, we have everything we need. We just need to use it. We need to make sure children get outside. We need to make sure they get adequate vitamin D in their diet. We need to make sure doctors know to look for it. We need to make sure immigrant communities, who are at higher risk, have access to information and resources. None of this is technically difficult. It is just a matter of attention and will. The Victorian reformers who fought against child labour, who pushed for better housing, who advocated for public parks, they did not have all the knowledge we have now. They did not know about vitamin D, but they knew that children needed sunlight and fresh air. They knew that cramming families into dark, overcrowded tenements was wrong. They knew that making 6-year-olds work in coal mines was unconscionable. And they fought to change it. What is our excuse? We have the knowledge they lacked. We have resources they could not imagine. And yet rickets persists. I think about those Victorian children sometimes. The ones whose legs bowed and whose spines curved because they spent their childhood in darkness, creating the products that made other people rich. Their suffering was visible. You could see it in their bones. And that visibility eventually sparked outrage and reform. But modern rickets is less visible because it affects fewer children, and those children are often in marginalized communities that do not have loud political voices. So the outrage is muted, the urgency is less, but the suffering is just as real. A child with bowed legs in 2025 is in just as much pain as a child with bowed legs in 1855. The calendar date does not matter to the child's bones. Coming up next, we need to talk about something that the Victorians found almost too terrible to discuss openly: maternal mortality. We need to explore what happened to women in childbirth, and why even in the most advanced hospitals of the time, giving birth could be more dangerous than not giving birth at all. We are going to discuss puerperal fever, the disease that killed new mothers within days of delivery. And we're going to tell the heartbreaking story of a doctor who figured out how to prevent maternal deaths but was mocked, rejected, and driven to insanity because his colleagues refused to believe that they themselves were the source of infection. This next section is about the intersection of medicine, pride, and tragedy. It is about how the people meant to help can sometimes harm, and it is about a truth so uncomfortable that an entire medical establishment rejected it rather than face what it meant. Stay close, because this story will make you grateful for modern obstetrics while simultaneously making you angry at how long it took to get here. Sleep well and maybe step outside tomorrow for 15 minutes of sunshine. Your bones will thank you. Imagine discovering the cure for a disease that kills thousands of women every year. You have the data, you have the evidence. You can prove that a simple action, washing hands with a disinfectant solution, reduces death rates by 90%. 90%. You present your findings to the medical establishment, and they laugh at you, they mock you, they call you a fanatic. They reject your evidence because accepting it would mean admitting something unbearable, that they themselves have been killing their patients. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the true story of Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian doctor working in Vienna in the 1840s, who figured out how to prevent puerperal fever, childbed fever, and was destroyed for it. Tonight, we are going to talk about one of the darkest chapters in medical history. We are going to explore why childbirth in Victorian hospitals was often more dangerous than giving birth at home. And we are going to tell you about a man who was right, who had the proof, and who died in an asylum, broken by a medical profession that could not handle the truth. But first, let me tell you what puerperal fever actually is, because you need to understand why women were so terrified of childbirth. Puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, is an infection of the female reproductive tract that occurs after childbirth. In the days following delivery, the woman would develop a fever. Her pulse would race. She would have severe abdominal pain. She would become delirious. And then, within days, sometimes within 24 to 48 hours of the first symptoms, she would die. The mortality rate in some hospitals reached 25 to 30%. Let me say that again. In some of the most advanced, prestigious hospitals in Europe, 1 in 4 women who gave birth would die from puerperal fever. Think about what that means. You are a woman in Victorian England. You are pregnant. You know that giving birth in a hospital surrounded by trained doctors and modern medical equipment gives you a 25% chance of dying. Those are terrible odds. You would be safer gambling at a casino. You would be safer in many actual battles. But this was supposed to be healthcare. This was supposed to be progress, and women knew it. They begged not to be taken to certain hospital wards. They would rather give birth at home, tended by midwives, because the mortality rates at home were much lower. The hospitals, the places that were supposed to help, were death traps. Now, why was puerperal fever so deadly in hospitals but less so at home? This was the mystery that haunted medical professionals for decades. The disease seemed to strike in patterns. Certain hospital wards would have epidemic after epidemic. Certain doctors seemed to have higher death rates among their patients than others, but nobody understood why. The prevailing theory, as with so many Victorian diseases, was miasma, bad air. Doctors thought that puerperal fever was caused by noxious vapours in the hospital environment. They tried improving ventilation. They tried moving patients to different wards. Nothing worked. Women kept dying. Enter Ignaz Semmelweis. In 1846, Semmelweis was working at the Vienna General Hospital in Austria, one of the largest maternity hospitals in the world. And he noticed something very strange. The hospital had 2 maternity clinics. The first clinic was staffed by doctors and medical students. The second clinic was staffed by midwives. And the death rate in the first clinic, the one with the doctors, was nearly 3 times higher than in the midwife clinic. 3 times higher. Women were literally begging not to be admitted to the doctor's clinic. They would rather give birth in the street than go there. And Semmelweis wanted to know why. He started investigating systematically. He looked at everything. Overcrowding? No, both clinics had similar patient loads. Ventilation? No, the clinics were in the same building. Diet? No, patients ate the same food. Birth position? The doctors had women give birth on their backs while midwives used a different position. But when Semmelweis had doctors switch positions, it made no difference. He was stumped. What were the doctors doing differently than the midwives? And then, in 1847, something happened that gave Semmelweis a terrible insight. A colleague of his, a pathologist named Jakob Koletschka, died after being accidentally cut by a student's scalpel during an autopsy. Semmelweis attended the autopsy of his friend. Yes, they did an autopsy on the pathologist. And he noticed something shocking. Koletschka's symptoms before death and the appearance of his internal organs were almost identical to what Semmelweis saw in women who died of puerperal fever. Identical. A man who'd been cut during an autopsy had died of the same disease that killed new mothers. And then it clicked. The doctors in the first clinic, they performed autopsies. They would do autopsies in the morning on women who had died of puerperal fever, and then they would go directly to the maternity ward and examine labouring women. They would go from corpses to live patients without washing their hands beyond a quick rinse with water. They did not know about bacteria. Germ theory had not been established yet. But Semmelweis realised that they were carrying something, some kind of cadaverous particles from the dead bodies to the living women. The midwives who did not perform autopsies were not carrying this contamination. That was the difference. Semmelweis immediately instituted a new policy in his clinic. He required all doctors and medical students to wash their hands with a chlorine solution, calcium hypochlorite dissolved in water, before examining any patient. Not just a quick rinse, a thorough scrubbing until the chlorine smell was gone and any smell of the autopsy room was eliminated. And the results were immediate and dramatic. The mortality rate in the doctor's clinic plummeted. It dropped from around 18% to less than 2%. Less than 2%. Semmelweis had cut deaths by 90% with a simple intervention, hand washing. You would think this would be celebrated, right? You would think the medical establishment would immediately adopt this life-saving practice. But they did not. They rejected it. Why? Because accepting Semmelweis's findings meant accepting an unbearable truth, that doctors themselves were the agents of death, that the very people who took an oath to do no harm had been killing women by the thousands with their contaminated hands. The psychological resistance to this idea was immense. Doctors in Vienna and across Europe attacked Semmelweis. They said his theory was absurd. They said correlation did not prove causation. They said he was a fanatic. Some took his findings as a personal insult to their professional competence and their moral character. How dare this young Hungarian suggest that distinguished physicians were responsible for their patients' deaths? The hostility was so intense that Semmelweis was eventually forced out of his position in Vienna. He moved to Budapest, where he continued to advocate for hand washing, but with limited success. And here is where the story becomes truly tragic. The constant rejection, the refusal of his colleagues to accept evidence that was right in front of their faces, the knowledge that women were dying unnecessarily because of medical pride, it broke Semmelweis. He became increasingly bitter and erratic. He wrote angry, accusatory letters to prominent obstetricians across Europe. He publicly called them murderers, which, to be fair, they kind of were, but this approach did not win him allies. His mental health deteriorated. In 1865, he was committed to a mental asylum, and 2 weeks later he died there at age 47, possibly from an infection caused by beatings he received from the asylum guards. The irony is almost too painful to bear. Semmelweis, who had spent his career trying to prevent infection, died of an infection in an institution where he'd been sent because people thought he was mad for insisting on preventing infection. He died rejected, ridiculed and broken. And women continued to die of puerperal fever because doctors would not wash their hands. It was not until after Semmelweis's death, when Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister developed germ theory and antiseptic practices became accepted, that the medical establishment finally understood what Semmelweis had been trying to tell them. By the 1870s and 80s, hand-washing and antiseptic procedures became standard in hospitals, and puerperal fever deaths dropped dramatically. Semmelweis had been right all along, but he never got to see his vindication. Now I want you to think about the women in this story, because while we focus on Semmelweis, and his story is important, we must not forget the thousands upon thousands of women who died preventable deaths because of medical arrogance. These were women who survived the enormous physical ordeal of childbirth, only to be killed by infection introduced by their doctors. Women who should have been celebrating new life, but instead were dying agonizing deaths. Women whose babies were left motherless. Women whose families were shattered. And this was happening in hospitals, in the institutions that were supposed to represent the pinnacle of medical knowledge. If you were a wealthy woman in Victorian London, you might hire a doctor to attend your birth because doctors were expensive and prestigious, and that decision might kill you. Meanwhile, poor women who could only afford midwives often survived because midwives did not have access to autopsy rooms and were not carrying the infection from patient to patient. There is a particular cruelty in the fact that Queen Victoria herself contributed to a problem that was killing other women. How? By popularizing the use of chloroform for pain relief during childbirth. Victoria used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853, and suddenly anesthesia during labour became fashionable and desirable. This was actually a wonderful development in many ways. Labour pain is real and severe, and pain relief was a genuine benefit. But it meant that more women sought hospital births attended by doctors because midwives did not have access to anaesthesia, so more women were exposed to the doctors who were not washing their hands. The pain relief that Victoria championed inadvertently led more women into the path of puerperal fever, and there was a religious dimension to this that makes it even darker. Before Victoria's use of chloroform, there was significant opposition to pain relief in childbirth on religious grounds. Genesis 3:16 says, "In pain you shall bring forth children." This was interpreted by some clergy as meaning that labour pain was divinely ordained, a punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. To seek relief from this pain was to oppose God's will. After Victoria, the Archbishop of Canterbury's daughter, used anaesthesia successfully, this opposition melted away. But it is worth noting that for years, religious doctrine contributed to women suffering unnecessarily. Their pain was considered not just inevitable, but righteous. Let me give you one more angle on puerperal fever that shows just how little Victorian medicine understood about preventing it. Doctors in the 19th century did not wear gloves during examinations or deliveries. They prided themselves on their ability to examine patients and assess conditions by touch. They would examine multiple women in succession, moving from one patient to another, using the same unwashed hands. They thought this demonstrated skill and experience. In reality, it was a disease transmission mechanism. One infected woman could lead to an entire ward outbreak as the doctor carried the infection from patient to patient, and the internal examinations themselves were often unnecessary and harmful. Victorian obstetrics involved frequent vaginal examinations to check on labour progress, but every examination was an opportunity to introduce infection. Doctors did not understand this. They thought they were providing attentive care. They were actually increasing risk. Midwives who examined less frequently and who had cleaner hands because they were not coming from autopsy rooms were inadvertently providing safer care by doing less. The story of puerperal fever and Semmelweis teaches us something crucial about medical progress. It is not just about discovering new knowledge. It is about accepting new knowledge, especially when that knowledge is uncomfortable. The evidence for hand washing was overwhelming. The mortality data was clear. But it took decades for the medical establishment to accept it because the implications were too painful. Admitting that Semmelweis was right meant admitting that thousands of women had died unnecessarily. It meant confronting medical hubris and professional pride. It meant changing established practices and hierarchies. And that was harder than accepting a new scientific theory. We like to think that science is objective, that evidence speaks for itself, that rational people will accept truth when presented with data. But the Semmelweis story shows us that is not always how it works. Social factors, psychological factors, institutional inertia, professional pride, these can all stand in the way of accepting even obvious truths. Semmelweis had the data. He had the proof. He reduced mortality by 90%. And it was not enough because the truth was too uncomfortable. This is a lesson that extends far beyond Victorian obstetrics. How many times in history has someone been right and been rejected because their truth challenged powerful interests or comfortable beliefs? How many times have we dismissed evidence because accepting it would mean admitting we were wrong? The Semmelweis reflex, as it is now called, is the tendency to reject new evidence that contradicts established norms. It happens in medicine, in science, in politics, in everyday life. We are all vulnerable to it. But here is what I find most moving about the Semmelweis story. Despite the rejection, despite the mockery, despite the personal cost, Semmelweis kept fighting. He kept presenting his data. He kept trying to convince his colleagues. He knew he was right, and he refused to back down even when it destroyed him. That is a kind of heroism, a tragic heroism, but heroism nonetheless. He sacrificed his career, his reputation, his mental health, and ultimately his life in service of a truth that could save lives. And eventually that truth prevailed. Not in time to save him, not in time to save the thousands of women who died while doctors rejected hand washing. But it did prevail. Today, hand hygiene is the cornerstone of infection control in healthcare. It is so basic, so fundamental that we teach it to medical students in their first weeks of training. Semmelweis is now honoured as a pioneer of antiseptic procedures. There are hospitals, streets and universities named after him. But his vindication came too late for him to know about it. He died thinking he had failed. In reality, he had succeeded. He had been right. And eventually the world caught up. Now we need to talk about another kind of suffering that Victorian society handled very badly: mental illness. We are going to explore the world of Victorian madhouses, where people were locked away for conditions we now understand and can treat. We are going to talk about diagnoses that were used to control women, about treatments that were torture, and about a society that believed mental illness meant moral failure. And we're going to explore the concept of madness in an era that had no real understanding of psychology, neurology, or psychiatric medicine. This next section is difficult, but it is important because it shows us how far we have come in understanding the human mind and how much further we still have to go. Stay with me, because the treatment of mental illness in Victorian times reveals some of the deepest cruelties of the era. Rest well and maybe be grateful that modern doctors wash their hands. What if I told you that in Victorian England a husband could have his wife locked away in an asylum simply because he disapproved of her behaviour? Not because she was dangerous, not because she was unable to care for herself, but because she was too independent, too outspoken, too interested in things he thought inappropriate for a woman. And once she was committed, she could be held indefinitely, subjected to treatments that ranged from useless to torturous, with no legal recourse and no hope of release unless her husband, the same man who had her locked up, agreed to it. This was not rare. This was not scandalous. This was legal. This was medicine. Tonight, we are going to explore one of the darkest aspects of Victorian society, the treatment of mental illness in an era that had no understanding of psychology, no effective treatments, and a tendency to label any deviation from social norms as madness. We are going to talk about diagnoses that were weapons against women, institutions that were more like prisons than hospitals, and treatments based on nothing more than guesswork and cruelty. And we are going to confront a disturbing question. How much of what the Victorians called madness was actually illness, and how much was just society punishing people who did not fit the mould? Let me start with a basic fact that shapes everything else. The Victorians had almost no understanding of mental illness as we conceive of it today. They had no concept of brain chemistry, neurotransmitters, psychological trauma, or neurological conditions. They could observe symptoms, depression, mania, delusions, confusion, but they had no framework for understanding what caused them or how to treat them effectively. Mental illness was often seen as a moral failing, a weakness of character, or in extreme cases, demonic possession or divine punishment. The idea that mental conditions were medical problems requiring medical treatment was only just beginning to emerge, and the treatments that did exist were largely ineffective and often harmful. The Victorian approach to mental illness was essentially to remove afflicted people from society. If you were wealthy and had a family member with mental illness, you might keep them at home under the care of servants, hidden away in a room where visitors would not see them. This was the origin of the mad woman in the attic trope that appears in Victorian literature. It was based on reality. Families would literally confine mentally ill relatives to upper floors or separate buildings on their estates away from public view. If you were poor, you went to an asylum. County asylums, state hospitals, institutions that were supposed to provide care, but that were often overcrowded, underfunded, and brutal. But here is where it gets really dark. Commitment to an asylum did not require what we would consider due process. For women especially, the standards were shockingly low. A husband's word, backed by a doctor's certificate, which could be obtained fairly easily, was often sufficient to have a woman committed. And what behaviours might warrant this? The list is infuriating. Women were committed for being too sexual or not sexual enough, for reading too much, for having political opinions, for disagreeing with their husbands, for spending money, for refusing to perform domestic duties, for what was called female troubles, which could mean anything from postpartum depression to menopause to just having strong emotions. There was even a specific diagnosis called hysteria that was applied almost exclusively to women. The word comes from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus, because ancient physicians believed the condition was caused by the uterus wandering around the body. The Victorians did not believe that exactly, but they did believe hysteria was uniquely female. Symptoms included fainting, nervousness, irritability, loss of appetite, and a tendency to cause trouble. Yes, causing trouble was considered a medical symptom. Hysteria was used to pathologize any woman who did not conform to Victorian ideals of passive, obedient femininity. And treatment? Everything from bed rest to cold water baths to, and I am not making this up, marriage, because of course what every hysterical woman needed was a husband to control her. Let me tell you about a novel that exposed this practice. In 1860, Wilkie Collins published The Woman in White, a sensation novel that became one of the best-selling books of the Victorian era. The plot involves a villainous husband who has his wife committed to an asylum even though she is perfectly sane, so he can control her fortune and marry another woman. Victorian readers were riveted by this story, not because it was far-fetched fantasy, but because it was recognizable reality. Everyone knew that asylums could be used this way. Everyone knew women who had disappeared into institutions. Collins was not inventing a scenario. He was dramatizing something that actually happened, and it was not just women, though they were particularly vulnerable. Men could also be committed, especially if they had no family to protect them, or if they behaved in ways that threatened social order. Political radicals, religious dissenters, people with epilepsy, people with developmental disabilities, people who were just inconvenient to their families, all could end up in asylums. Once there, the conditions were often appalling. Overcrowding was standard. Patients might be chained to walls or beds. They might be kept in cells barely larger than closets. Sanitation was poor. Food was inadequate. Violence from staff was common. Treatment options were primitive at best. One common treatment was bleeding or purging based on the old humoral theory we have talked about before. Doctors thought that removing blood or inducing vomiting and diarrhea would help balance the body's humours and cure mental disturbance. It did not. It just weakened already vulnerable patients. Another treatment was restraint. Patients who were agitated or violent would be put in straitjackets, locked in isolation cells, or physically restrained for hours or days. This was called therapeutic restraint, as if being tied up was somehow healing. There was also something called hydrotherapy, which sounds pleasant. Water therapy, right? But was actually quite brutal. Patients would be subjected to powerful jets of cold water aimed at the head, or they would be wrapped tightly in wet sheets for hours, or they would be repeatedly dunked in cold baths. The theory was that shocking the system would somehow shock the patient back to sanity. The reality was hypothermia, pneumonia, and terror. Some asylums practiced moral treatment, which was actually one of the more humane approaches. The idea was that mental illness was caused by stress and bad living conditions, so providing a calm, orderly, pleasant environment would help patients recover. Patients were given meaningful work, opportunities for recreation, and treated with respect. And you know what? For some patients, this actually helped. A calm, structured environment, regular meals, productive activity, and kind treatment can improve mental health. Who would have thought? The problem was that moral treatment was expensive and labour-intensive. It required well-trained staff, good facilities, and low patient-to-staff ratios. As asylums became more overcrowded, moral treatment became impossible to maintain. It degraded into mere custodial care, warehousing people without any real attempt at treatment. Now let me talk about a specific type of poisoning that the Victorians mistook for mental illness: mercury poisoning. Remember mercury from the syphilis section? Mercury was used for all sorts of conditions, and chronic mercury exposure caused a condition called mercurial erethism, also known as Mad Hatter's disease because it was common among hat makers who used mercury in felting. The symptoms included tremors, emotional instability, pathological shyness, and frequent sighing. People with mercurial erethism would often be diagnosed as mentally ill and potentially committed to asylums, but their condition was not mental illness in the psychiatric sense. It was neurological damage from a toxic metal. If you stopped the mercury exposure, symptoms could improve, but doctors did not make that connection. They saw someone acting strangely and labelled them mad. Similarly, conditions we now understand as neurological or medical, epilepsy, brain tumours, strokes, dementia, hormonal imbalances, were all lumped together as madness because the Victorians had no way to distinguish them. An elderly person with Alzheimer's disease might end up in an asylum. A child with autism might be institutionalized. A person with schizophrenia, who today might be managed with medication and support, would be locked away with no hope of improvement. The tragedy is that many of these people were not violent or dangerous. They just needed understanding and appropriate care, neither of which Victorian asylums could provide. There is one more aspect of Victorian mental health treatment that I need to mention, and it involves one of the most controversial figures in medical history. In the late Victorian period and into the early 20th century, some doctors began experimenting with surgical interventions for mental illness. This would eventually lead to lobotomy, which was not perfected, if we can call it that, until the 1930s and 40s. But the groundwork was laid in the Victorian era with ideas about physical intervention in the brain. The idea that you could cure mental illness by cutting into the brain was born from the Victorian desperation to do something, anything, to treat conditions they did not understand. We look back on lobotomy now with horror, and rightly so, but it came from the same impulse that drove all Victorian medical experimentation, the desperate hope that science could solve problems that seemed unsolvable. I want you to think about what it must have been like to be a patient in a Victorian asylum. Imagine being fully aware, fully capable of rational thought, but trapped in an institution because someone in your family decided you were inconvenient. Imagine trying to explain that you are not mad, that there has been a mistake, that you should not be there. And imagine having your protest taken as further proof of your insanity. The more vehemently you insist on your sanity, the more they believe you are delusional. It is a perfect trap. This was the scenario Collins dramatised in The Woman in White, and it was a fear that haunted Victorian society. Anyone could disappear into an asylum. Once inside, escape was nearly impossible. The stigma of mental illness was profound. If you had a mental breakdown and recovered, your reputation was permanently damaged. You would be considered unreliable, potentially dangerous, someone to be watched. Women who had been in asylums were considered unmarriageable. Men who had been institutionalized found it hard to get employment. The stain never went away. This meant that families often went to great lengths to hide mental illness. They would keep relatives at home under terrible conditions rather than admit them to asylums, not primarily out of compassion, but out of fear of social consequences. And yet there were reformers who fought for better treatment. Dorothea Dix in America, John Connolly in England, Philippe Pinel in France. These were people who advocated for humane treatment of the mentally ill. They pushed for the end of chains and physical restraints. They promoted moral treatment and therapeutic engagement. They argued that people with mental illness deserved dignity and care, not punishment and confinement. Their work led to real improvements in some institutions, but reform was slow, inconsistent, and often underfunded. The gap between the ideal of compassionate care and the reality of overcrowded, underfunded asylums remained wide throughout the Victorian era and beyond. Here is something that should give us pause. We like to think we have moved beyond the Victorian approach to mental illness. We have medications now, we have therapy, we have neuroscience. We understand that mental illness is medical, not moral. We do not lock people away just for being different. Except, do we not? We still stigmatize mental illness. We still struggle with adequate funding for mental health services. We still have people with mental illness ending up in prisons instead of treatment facilities. We still have families who hide mental illness out of shame. We have made enormous progress in understanding and treating mental health conditions, but the social and systemic problems that plagued the Victorians are still with us in different forms. The Victorian story of mental illness teaches us about the danger of labelling people as other. Once someone is categorized as mad, as fundamentally different from normal people, it becomes easy to justify treating them as less than human. It becomes easy to lock them away, to ignore their suffering, to experiment on them. The categories we create, sane versus insane, normal versus abnormal, mentally healthy versus mentally ill, these categories have real power. They determine who gets compassion and who gets confinement. And we need to be very careful about how we draw those lines and what we do with people who fall on the wrong side of them. The Victorians drew those lines badly. They pathologized normal human variation. They turned grief, anger, and independence into diseases requiring treatment. They used medical diagnosis as a tool of social control, and thousands of people suffered because of it. We can learn from their mistakes. We can recognize that mental health exists on a spectrum, that suffering is not the same as madness, that people deserve help rather than punishment. We can acknowledge that we still do not understand everything about the human mind, and that humility is essential when dealing with complex conditions. And we can remember that compassion should always come before control. We have reached the end of our journey through Victorian diseases. We have explored cholera and tuberculosis, syphilis and diphtheria, scarlet fever and typhus, smallpox and measles, rickets and puerperal fever, and now mental illness. Each one tells us something about the Victorian world, about their understanding of disease, their social structures, their values, and their struggles. But more than that, each one tells us something about ourselves, because we are the inheritors of their battles, their discoveries, and yes, their mistakes. In our final section, we are going to step back and look at what we can learn from all of these stories. We are going to talk about the legacy of Victorian medicine, what changed and what did not, and what the diseases of the past can teach us about the health challenges of the present and future. Stay with me for this last reflection, because the lessons of Victorian illness are not just historical curiosities. They are warnings, guideposts, and reminders of how hard-won our current health is, and how fragile it remains. Rest well and be grateful that we live in an age that at least attempts to understand the human mind with compassion rather than chains. We have travelled through 12 chapters of suffering, death, and hard-won triumph. We have watched cholera turn London into a graveyard in 24 hours. We have seen tuberculosis romanticised while it killed 1 in 3. We have witnessed mercury poison people in the name of curing them. We have stood beside parents burying half their children before age 5. We have explored diseases of progress, diseases of poverty, diseases of ignorance, and diseases of pride. And now, as we reach the end of this journey, I want to ask you the most important question of all. What does any of this matter? Why should we care about Victorian diseases in the 21st century? Why spend hours learning about suffering that ended generations ago? The answer is simple and urgent. Because it has not ended. Because the battles the Victorians fought are still being fought. Because the lessons they learned are being forgotten. And because the price of forgetting is measured in human lives. Let me start with the most obvious lesson, the one that threads through almost every story we have told. Infrastructure matters. Clean water matters, sanitation matters, housing matters, public health is not optional, it is not a luxury, it is the foundation of civilization. The Victorians learned this the hard way. They built cities that generated enormous wealth while simultaneously creating conditions for epidemic disease. They crammed people into slums without clean water or sewage systems. And then they were shocked, when cholera and typhoid killed thousands. But eventually they learned. They built the sewers. They separated drinking water from sewage. They improved housing standards. They created public health regulations. and diseases retreated. Not because the bacteria evolved to become less dangerous, not because humans developed natural immunity, but because the Victorians changed the environment in which diseases spread. They made it harder for pathogens to jump from person to person. They created barriers between human waste and human consumption. They invested enormous sums of money in boring, unglamorous infrastructure that saved millions of lives. And here is what we need to understand: that infrastructure still protects us, right now, today. Every time you turn on a tap and clean water comes out, that is Victorian engineering still working. Every time sewage disappears into pipes you never think about, that is Victorian public health still functioning. We take it for granted. We assume it will always be there. But infrastructure requires maintenance. It requires investment. It requires political will. And when we neglect it, when we underfund water systems, when we ignore aging sewers, when we allow infrastructure to decay, diseases come back. We saw this in Flint, Michigan, when lead contaminated the water supply because officials wanted to save money. We see it in communities around the world where clean water and sanitation are not guaranteed. We see it every time a public health system is starved of funding and disease outbreaks occur that could have been prevented. The Victorian lesson is clear: invest in infrastructure or pay in lives. There is no third option. Second lesson: vaccines work. This seems like it should be obvious, but apparently it needs to be said again and again. The Victorians would have given anything for the vaccines we have. They watched diphtheria strangle their children. They watched measles and whooping cough kill by the thousands. They watched smallpox blind and disfigure. And when vaccines became available, they fought hard to make them accessible to everyone, because they remembered what life was like without them. They had buried the children. They knew the stakes. We have forgotten. We have been so successful at controlling vaccine-preventable diseases that many people today have never seen what measles or diphtheria or whooping cough actually do. They think these are mild childhood illnesses. They are not. They were killers. They still are killers in places where vaccination rates are low. The only reason they seem mild to us is because vaccination has made them rare. But rare is not the same as gone. The bacteria and viruses that cause these diseases still exist. They are just waiting for populations with low immunity, and when we allow vaccination rates to drop, they come roaring back. We have seen this happen. Measles outbreaks in communities with low vaccination rates. Whooping cough epidemics. Diphtheria cases in countries where vaccination programs have broken down. These are preventable tragedies. Completely preventable. The Victorians fought anti-vaccine movements and eventually won because the evidence was overwhelming. We have the same evidence. We have even more evidence. We have the benefit of seeing vaccine success at a global scale. Smallpox is gone, polio is nearly gone, but we're allowing misinformation and fear to undermine one of the greatest public health achievements in history. The Victorian parents who lost children to diphtheria would be appalled. Third lesson: class and health are inseparable. Every Victorian disease we have discussed hit poor people harder than wealthy people. Not because poor people were inherently weaker or less careful, but because poverty creates conditions in which disease thrives. Overcrowding, malnutrition, lack of access to healthcare, dangerous working conditions, exposure to pollution and toxins. Victorian reformers recognized this. Edwin Chadwick compiled statistics showing that life expectancy in poor neighborhoods was half that of wealthy neighborhoods. The evidence was undeniable. Health is a social issue, not just a medical one, and this is still true. In wealthy countries, there are significant health disparities based on income, race, and geography. Poor communities have higher rates of chronic disease, shorter life expectancies, less access to quality health care. Globally, the disparities are even more stark. A child born in Norway has a completely different health trajectory than a child born in Chad, not because of genetics, but because of social and economic conditions. The Victorian lesson is that you cannot separate health from social justice. If you care about public health, you have to care about poverty, housing, education, and inequality. You cannot treat disease in isolation from the conditions that create it. Fourth lesson. Medical hubris kills. Remember Semmelweis? He reduced maternal mortality by 90% with a simple intervention, hand-washing. And the medical establishment rejected him because accepting his findings would mean admitting they had been wrong, admitting they had been killing patients. That pride, that refusal to accept uncomfortable evidence cost thousands of lives. The Semmelweis story teaches us that doctors are not infallible. Medical institutions are not infallible. When evidence contradicts established practice, we need to be willing to change, no matter how uncomfortable that change might be. This is still relevant. How many times has the medical establishment been slow to accept new evidence because it challenges dogma? How many times have patients been harmed because doctors refuse to listen or change their practices? The history of medicine is full of Semmelweis stories. People who were right and were rejected because the truth was inconvenient. We need to build systems that are more open to evidence and less protective of ego. We need to value patient outcomes over professional pride. The Victorians learned this lesson the hard way. We should not have to relearn it. Fifth lesson. Progress is not linear and it is not inevitable. The Victorians made enormous strides in public health. They went from a society where 40 to 50% of children died before age 5 to a society where childhood death became relatively rare. But that progress required sustained effort, investment, and political will. It did not happen automatically, and it can be reversed. We have seen rickets come back. We have seen vaccine-preventable diseases resurge. We have seen infrastructure crumble and public health systems underfunded. Progress requires maintenance. It requires each generation to value and protect the gains that previous generations fought for. We cannot coast on Victorian achievements forever. We have to actively choose to continue the work they started. Sixth lesson. Compassion is not optional. The Victorian treatment of mentally ill people was cruel because they lacked understanding, yes, but also because they lacked compassion. They saw people who were different and decided they needed to be controlled, confined, punished. They used medical diagnosis as a weapon of social control, and thousands suffered because of it. The lesson here is that when we lose our compassion for vulnerable people, when we start seeing them as problems to be managed rather than humans deserving of dignity, we create systems of cruelty. This applies to mental health, but it also applies to how we treat people with disabilities, people who are homeless, people who are addicted, people who are incarcerated. The categories change, but the underlying question remains: do we treat people with compassion or do we treat them as other? The Victorians made the wrong choice too often. We can choose differently. Seventh lesson. Individual choices have collective consequences. Vaccination is the clearest example of this. When you choose not to vaccinate your child, you are not just making a decision for your family. You're affecting community immunity. You're increasing risk for people who cannot be vaccinated. Infants, immunocompromised individuals, elderly people. Your choice becomes their risk. The Victorians understood this. They made vaccination mandatory because they recognized that some public health measures require collective action. Individual freedom is important, but it has to be balanced against collective responsibility. We live in a society, not a collection of isolated individuals. Our choices affect each other. The Victorian diseases teach us that some health decisions are too important to be left purely to individual discretion. But here is the uncomfortable truth I have to address. Victorian public health was not all noble progress. The same sanitary reforms that saved lives were also used to justify colonialism and racism. The idea that civilized Europeans understood hygiene while backward peoples did not was used to justify imperial conquest. Public health measures were sometimes imposed coercively on populations who had no voice in how they were implemented. The history is complicated. We can acknowledge that Victorian public health advances saved millions of lives, while also acknowledging that the framework was often racist, classist, and authoritarian. We can learn from their successes without repeating their injustices. Now let me bring all of this together with a question. What would a Victorian person think if they could see our world? They would be amazed. Infant mortality under 1%, polio nearly eradicated, antibiotics that can cure infections in days, surgery performed with anesthesia and antiseptic technique, mental illness treated with compassion and medication instead of chains. They would think we live in a medical paradise, and in many ways we do. The average person today has access to healthcare that Victorian royalty could not have imagined. But they would also be confused by some things. They would see us allowing vaccine-preventable diseases to return. They would see us cutting public health funding. They would see us treating infrastructure as an expense rather than an investment. They would see us accepting that millions of children still die of preventable diseases, just in other countries, just out of sight. They would ask, "You have all this knowledge, all these tools, all this wealth, and you are not using them to save every life you can. Why not?" And what would we say? That it is too expensive? The Victorians built sewer systems that cost staggering amounts of money because they decided it was worth it. That people do not want government intervention. The Victorians passed mandatory vaccination laws because they prioritized children's lives over political ideology. That mental health is not a real priority. The Victorian reformers who fought for humane treatment of mentally ill people would be disappointed to see how we still stigmatize and underfund mental health services. We would have a hard time justifying our choices to people who fought so hard with so much less. Here is what I want you to take away from these 12 chapters. The Victorian diseases were not ancient history, they were recent. My great-great-grandparents lived through this. Maybe yours did too. The world where half of children died, where tuberculosis killed 1 in 3 adults, where cholera could devastate a city in weeks. That world was only a few generations ago. The fact that we live in a different world now is not an accident of nature. It is an achievement of human effort. Scientists who spent their lives studying disease, doctors who fought for new treatments, engineers who designed water systems, reformers who pushed for better living conditions, politicians who funded public health, parents who demanded vaccines for their children. All of these people, working across generations, created the world we take for granted. And it is fragile. It is so fragile. A few years of neglecting infrastructure, a few years of declining vaccination rates, a few years of cutting public health funding, that is all it takes for Victorian diseases to return. We have seen it happen. The diseases never went away. We just built barriers between them and us. And if we stop maintaining those barriers, the diseases will cross them. So what do? We remember. We tell these stories. We make sure each generation understands what was lost and what was gained. We fund public health even when, especially when it seems to be working fine, because the evidence of success is the absence of crisis. We vaccinate our children. We invest in infrastructure. We treat healthcare as a right, not a privilege. We approach mental health with compassion. We recognize that individual health and community health are inseparable. We learn from Victorian mistakes without repeating them, and we honor the people who fought these battles by continuing their work. The Victorian era teaches us that humanity can overcome enormous challenges. We can defeat diseases that have plagued us for millennia. We can build systems that protect millions. We can turn tragedy into knowledge and knowledge into action. But it also teaches us that this victory is never final. Every generation has to choose whether to build on the progress of the past or let it crumble. Every generation has to decide whether the lives saved by public health measures are worth the cost and effort to maintain them. We are living in that decision right now. The diseases that terrified the Victorians are still out there. Cholera still kills. Tuberculosis still kills. Measles still kills. Diphtheria still kills. They're just killing people we do not see in places we do not think about. And some of them are creeping back into wealthy countries because we have grown complacent. The Victorian parents who buried their children would tell us, do not become complacent, do not forget. Do not waste the tools we died wishing for. Do not squander the progress we sacrificed to build. So as we close this journey through Victorian illness, I leave you with both gratitude and responsibility. Gratitude for the fact that we live in an age where childhood death is rare, where most diseases are preventable or treatable, where giving birth is not a likely death sentence, where mental illness is understood as medical rather than moral, and responsibility to protect these gains, to extend them to everyone, and to pass them on to future generations intact. The Victorians fought in darkness, we fight in light. We have knowledge they lacked. We have tools they could not imagine. We have no excuse for failure except our own choices, so choose wisely. Choose compassion. Choose science. Choose investment into public health. Choose to remember, because the alternative is returning to a world where diseases terrify, where children die, where suffering is normal. We have been there. The Victorians lived it, and they fought desperately to build us a better world. The least we can do is not throw it away. Thank you for staying with me through these 12 chapters. Thank you for listening to these stories of suffering and triumph. And thank you for caring enough about the past to learn its lessons for the future. Sleep well tonight, in a world that is safer and healthier than the Victorians could have dreamed, and wake up ready to keep it that way. Good night, everyone. And remember, progress is not a gift, it is a responsibility.